The story begins with a huge burning hand. Several people stood next to it and wondered if they could do it. They wondered if the enemy had finally retreated. Warrior Golan said that they had not been able to finish off the demon lord, but they had seriously wounded him. Hero Eric agreed, and then said that the demon lord would not be able to act for some time. Warrior Golan was glad that they could finally return to their families. Suddenly he turned to Lek, who was sitting silently. The boy wondered what would happen if he could turn the item into magic dust. He changed the wording and asked if he could do it without destroying her main body. Eric and Golan looked at the boy with some confusion, thinking that this was happening again. The mage asked if his comrades had said anything. Golan sighed and said that this was Lek. Even though they had driven away the demon lord, he was still attracted to that hand. Golan said that this was the reason Lek still didn't have a girlfriend. The young mage asked how the demon lord's hand could help him get the girl. Golan said that at this rate Mr. Locke would be alone for a long time. Locke looked at them and said that he felt like he was being slandered for no reason. Everyone was about to leave. During their journey, Golan suddenly turned to Locke. He said it was good to have a family waiting for him, and the warrior said it would be very good if Locke had a family like that. In response, the mage said that Eric and Golan were like family to him. Their group consisted of Hero Eric, Warrior Golan, and Mage Locke, and they fought against the demon lord from another dimension. Eventually, they were able to drive him back into the dimensional rift. Suddenly, Locke noticed something unusual and stopped. His comrades stopped after him. Suddenly, they discovered monsters behind them. They thought they were just being laughed at. As it turned out, the great army of demons managed to catch up with them here too. Eric raised his sword and sighed. He was amazed that there were so many of these monsters left. After that, Golan also raised his weapon. They were seriously injured, and if they continued to fight, they would be destroyed. However, they couldn't let the hero Eric die, because the demon lord was still alive. When the demon lord recovered, they would definitely need the hero's power. Mage Locke began to use his power. He activated many magic circles, then told his comrades to leave it to him and get out of there. Eric objected, asking what Locke was talking about. He said that they simply couldn't leave their friend here alone. Golan backed him up and told him not to talk nonsense. Locke looked at them sternly and said that their families and children were waiting for them. There was a tense silence after that. They tried to say something, but found no words. Locke raised his hand and asked them what had happened, then said that he would catch up with them as soon as he could. They were shocked by these words, but there was nothing they could do. They rushed forward to the exit, apologizing for it along the way. As they ran, tears of despair began to appear in Golan's eyes. Eric turned around. All he could wish for his friend was not to die in this place. In just a few moments, Locke was left alone in this cave with the monsters. Being so close to the guy, the monsters began to take out their weapons. Mage Locke kept up with his opponents. He activated the magic circles and then shouted for those damn demons to start attacking him. He declared that they would not pass his defenses so easily. Using magic, he attacked the enemies fiercely, wanting to protect his friends behind him. One by one, Locke killed the monsters. The number of defeated members of the Demon Lord's army had already exceeded 50. Locke stood on a pile of bodies and thought about how many monsters he had already defeated. The guy had already stopped counting. The corpses of demons turn into magic, like a thick fog, and then disappear. Locke didn't know how much time had passed since he had parted ways with the others. The demon army's cores had never been reduced, and the mage soon realized his limits. Then, suddenly, a turning point came for them. Locke was being held by the neck by a huge monster. It was a demon commander, one of the highest class of demons. He squeezed the helpless magician's neck hard. The boy quickly realized that this demon was sucking out this life force. This was a high-class magic that only high-ranking demons could use. It was called life transfer, draining touch. After the demon had sucked the amount of life energy he needed out of the boy, he threw him to the ground. Locke coughed heavily, realizing with horror that all of his remaining magic and almost all of his life force had been drained. He guessed that the monster must have changed its approach, deciding that it couldn't defeat Locke with physical attacks. The boy slowly started to get up from the ground. He stated that, despite this, it was now his turn to use the spell. At that very moment, the boy received a notification that the training was complete. He created a magic circle, after which he began to use the same life transfer. draining touch. He said he could learn any magic that had ever been used on him. Life transfer, drain touch. This technique allowed Laku to replenish his mana and restore his health at the same time. The boy picked up the demon commander's sword from the ground. This sword easily allowed his magical power to flow. With a new, more powerful weapon in his hands, Lak found himself surrounded by a crowd of monsters. He shouted to them to attack him, for now he was confident that he would be able to fight even for years. At this time, the city was extremely unsettled. The young girl looked out the window with interest, trying to see something. Someone nearby told her that he was going to turn off the light right now, so the girl had better go to bed. The girl told her mother that she felt that there might be monsters in this place tonight. Her mother listened to her, but she also said that this country was protected by a great sage, and therefore, they would be fine. She told the girl, Solaris, to calm down and go to bed. The girl obeyed her mother. At the same time, on the street, someone in a raincoat was holding a chicken in his hands, which was making different sounds quite loudly. Someone asked a girl named Gerberg if something had happened to her. At that moment, several people with cat ears and tails turned to look at her. The girl looked at them, but did not answer. She also had cat ears. At this point, Lak felt like he had been fighting for a very long time. Several hours or maybe several months had passed. He had long since lost his sense of time. Whenever he felt sleepy, he cast a spell on himself called Puppet. Puppet was originally a piece of black magic used to manipulate enemies. Using it, he would be able to continue fighting even in his sleep by making his entire body mobile. Mage Luck continued to fight for an unknown amount of time. During these battles, he had already lost almost all of the human emotions he once had. As if by some twist of fate, the one who brought back the emotions of this unfortunate mage Laku was the demon lord himself. The monster appeared completely unexpectedly. In the first moments of being in the rift, he swung his weapon strongly in order to hit the guy. Quickly and terrifyingly, the demon attacked the guy with his power. From the attack that the demon made on the magician, a huge trace spread out, going far back. Suddenly, another blow followed from the end that the monster's attack had touched, this time aimed at the demon lord. The monster was a little surprised to see such unusual activity. As if from the ashes, a barely alive Locke rose from the other end. He glanced at the demon with a sharp look, then exclaimed loudly, noting that the monster had already recovered. It was quite unexpected for him, but he had already learned how to fight high-class demons in this interdimensional rift. The boy rushed to attack, simultaneously thinking about his every action. First of all, he wanted to switch to close combat and not let the demon lord use fire magic. After that, he had another plan of action. The boy quickly rushed toward the monster. The demon lord tried to grab Lak, but only the magician's cloak remained in his hand. Suddenly, Lak was right behind the demon. At the same time, the boy was gathering his strength to use a spell on the monster. He brought his hand to the back of the demon lord's head and then quickly used life transfer, draining touch. Just as he was about to cast a spell on the monster, Lak saw something that startled him. The spell failed because at the very last moment, the demon lord managed to use a magical barrier to protect himself. After the mage's spell failed, the demon used another attack in haste, with which he destroyed Lak's armor that covered his stomach. The boy was a little depressed about the situation he found himself in. After such an unfortunate situation, the demon lord raised his sword again and tried to attack the boy again. Lak began to block the monster's attack, but to his surprise, the guy's weapon couldn't withstand the force, causing it to crack. Following the broken weapon, the attack caught up with the guy, cutting him vertically. The guy quickly got to his feet and tried to stop from the shockwave. The boy realized that even if he poured more mana into his new demon commander sword, it was still not at the level to withstand attacks from the cursed demon lord's sword. The guy grinned ambiguously. He exclaimed to the monster that he shouldn't be happy just because he broke the boy's sword. He stated that he was a mage after all. After saying this, Lak rushed forward with a magic circle, with which he activated the fire prison. While holding the spell with one hand, he also raised the other one in order to use the second spell. He brought his hand closer, and then successfully used life transfer, draining touch. The shockwave from such a strong attack was impressive. The skin began to burn, and he himself began to cough. While Lak burned in his own fiery prison, he continued to use the withering touch. Having no room or opportunity for error or pause, the magician took everything he could from the demon lord. The demon lord's magical barrier was all focused on protecting itself from the fiery prison. In other words, the withering touch could pass through the demon lord's barrier without hindrance. The boy once again created a magic circle in his hand and then shouted for the demon to choose. He smiled cruelly and said that the demon lord could either burn in the young mage's flames, or the boy would suck all the monster's life force dry from him. Within a few moments, a huge flash appeared in the cave, followed by absolute silence. After an unknown amount of time, the entire battlefield was covered in a thick layer of roots, from which a single sword stuck out. Suddenly, disturbing this peace, someone's hand burst out of the ground. Climbing out of the ground, the head of a young guy appeared after the hand, and he sighed with relief. Wearing only shorts, he rose to the surface and stared at the sword, which was also sticking out of the ground. He was silent for a while, and then finally asked if this meant he had won. Realizing that everything was really as he had understood, Luck cried out joyfully. He was truly glad that he had finally succeeded in his business. The boy raised his hands high, loudly rejoicing that he had protected both the heroes and his world. Lack couldn't contain his emotions. In a fit of joy, the boy suddenly noticed something unusual after he sneezed loudly and heavily. The boy began to shake from the cold because, as it turned out, all his clothes had been destroyed during this terrible battle. During these thoughts, his gaze fell again on the sword, which was still in the ground. Lack immediately pulled it out of the ground, after which he said that he had lost all his clothes and money, and perhaps he would sell this damn sword. The guy wondered if he could really sell such a rarity. He walked towards the exit, wondering how long he had been fighting in this dimensional rift after all. Lack had only guessed that it had been several months, perhaps a year or more. After the time it had taken Lack to get out, he finally stepped onto the ground. He went out and looked at the sky. The guy looked around and asked out loud, completely not understanding where he was at the moment. Through the thick grass, he came to a small sign, from where he learned in which direction the main road was. He looked at the sign for a moment, then thought that he would figure it out if he continued walking straight down this road. After a while, the sun began to rise over the horizon, illuminating everything around. By this time, Lack had already managed to reach the edge of the fields. With one hand, the guy was holding the sword on his shoulders, which he was going to sell in the future. He looked at the small kingdom that opened up before him. The guy looked at this city carefully and wondered if it could be the capital of the kingdom. He walked up to the entrance of the castle quite quickly and said that the atmosphere was different from what he remembered, but he didn't quite understand when they managed to build all this. The guards noticed the suspicious guy right at the entrance. Completely ignoring the presence of any guards, Lack calmly walked straight ahead. Noticing this, the two men who were standing guard were a little taken aback, but hurried to stop the guy in order to ask a few questions. In honest confusion, Lack asked them what had happened. In response, the guards simply stated that this was something they should be asking him. They did not understand what was wrong with the guy's appearance, since he was wearing almost no clothes, except for his shorts. Lack sighed heavily, then said that he had, in truth, gone through a brutal battle in the interdimensional rift, resulting in the loss of all his belongings, including his bag and adventurer card. Hearing this, the two guards looked at each other in disbelief. After that, one of the guards patted Lack on the shoulders understandingly and said that he understood everything. After that, the guard asked if this boy had really met robbers on the way, and then asked Lack if that was true. Hearing this, the boy was extremely surprised. He firmly stated that these were not bandits but a brutal battle. He was also tense that he was called a boy. They agreed with him rather sarcastically and then said that it must be very annoying. The second one supported him and said that, as a young guy, he probably always wanted to be cool. They certainly didn't believe him, but they continued to mock him. They said that even though he had such a big sword, he lost. They laughed, saying that no matter how strong he was, there was always a chance that he would be outnumbered. Lack was so tired of trying to prove something to these guards that he finally just agreed with them and said that they were right. After that, he had to say that from now on he would try to be more careful. After that, the guards asked Lack if he had any papers that could confirm his identity. The guy said with annoyance that he had lost them. The guards, again, did not believe him and decided that they had been taken along with the wallet. One of the guards took a few sheets of paper and said that in that case he would make the guy temporary ones. After that, he asked the guy's name. Without thinking twice, Lack calmly said his name. Hearing this, the guard who was holding the papers in his hands was a little taken aback by this name. After this, both guards looked at each other again. They laughed. The amazed boy asked if it was a bad name. A contented Lack walked around the city, happy that those guards had given him some clothes. A large sword hung on his belt. Lack smiled widely, thinking that those guards were kind. He also noticed that everything in the country seemed to be quite calm. The boy waved at an unfamiliar old woman who was passing by. He thought that maybe he should see them before going to the guild. Lack politely asked the old woman if she knew where the warrior Golan's house was. The woman said that if he was looking for it, he should go in that direction. After some time, which Lack spent on the short road, he stood and silently looked, his mouth open. In front of him stood a simply enormous house, which he did not expect to see at all. Lack told the butler that he wanted to meet Mr. Golan, and then asked if he was home. The butler asked dryly if Lack had an appointment with him. The guy said that he had no specific or scheduled appointments, but if the butler said that Lack was here, Golan would immediately understand. The butler sighed heavily and said that he would not let the guy in without prior arrangement, because there were a lot of people like him coming. The boy exclaimed that he had already said that it was luck, but the butler stood his ground, saying that it was simply impossible. Displeased, Luck stared at the man through the gate, then walked away and exclaimed that he would return, so the butler had better remember these words. He asked Luck not to come again. Unhappy with this attitude, Lack walked through the city. Suddenly he stopped and fell silent. He said that he would not let a guy dressed like him now, and with a sword either. Lack decided that first he would buy new clothes, and then he would return. But first he needed to restore his adventurer card. Coming out to the square, Lack suddenly saw a huge statue. He looked at it carefully and thought that this statue had not been here before. He wondered when they had managed to put it up. Suddenly he noticed that the person depicted on the status was a magician. He noted that this person was quite nice. The boy turned to a man who was standing near him and asked if the stranger knew in whose honor the statue was erected. The shocked man asked how the guy could not know about such a thing. Luck apologized for being so rude. The man quickly looked Luck over from head to toe. After this, he arrogantly stated that he understood that the guy came from the village and simply had not heard anything about this great hero. The man said with some pride that the statue was built in honor of a great hero named Lack. Hearing this, the boy was stunned. Lack asked again about the name he had just heard. The man said that the boy should have heard that name. He said that it was a great hero who had sacrificed himself 10 years ago to hold off the demon army. Lack looked at the statue again, but this time he was experiencing completely different emotions. He realized that it was he who was depicted on this huge and great status. Lack started shouting loudly, denying that the man was not so cute. He asked if the man knew about it. Hearing this, the man was a little confused, after which he exclaimed that Lack should not dare to say such rude things about the great sage. He pointed his finger at the boy and stated that this world currently exists only because Mr. Luck once saved it. The guy turned around skeptically, looking at the statue. Not knowing what to say to this, he stated that he simply thought it was just a myth. Hearing this, the man looked at Lack sternly and said that if he was so careless, then Raku's fans might kill him, despite the fact that he was only a child. The guy thought that sounded scary. He looked ahead wearily and thought that he was extremely interested to know who had built his monument, since it didn't even really look like him. Looking at the beautiful face of the monument, he assumed that Eric and Golan had built it. He could only think that it looked nothing like him in reality. To him, it only meant that his dear friends probably thought he had died in battle long ago. Not knowing what to do, Lack simply turned around and walked away. He couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said about it being 10 years. Lack was sure he didn't remember fighting for that long. He figured there must have been some kind of mistake. Lack arrived at the guild headquarters. As if on purpose, he saw himself there again. In the Adventurers Guild, there was a notice that a ceremony was currently underway in honor of the 10th anniversary of the death of the great sage, Mr. Lack. The boy fell to his knees in despair. He simply could not believe that 10 years had already passed. He thought that he really wanted to intervene for many reasons. But right now, his priority was to restore his adventurer card. With tears in his eyes, Luck approached the reception desk and politely addressed the girl who was sitting there. Ignoring all the politeness of the guy, the unknown person from the guild hall loudly asked, "Since when this place managed to become a kindergarten?" Lack turned around and saw behind him a brazen man who was smiling slyly, and next to him sat another man who looked more insecure. Luck ignored him and told the girl at the counter that he wanted to restore his card. The angry man shouted at the guy not to ignore him. Lack turned around in surprise and asked if he was talking about him. The man said that he had spoken to this very boy. Lack scratched his head tiredly. After that, he asked where he looked like a boy. At that very moment, he looked 10 years old. The man approached Luck and said that no matter how he looked at him, the guy looked like a teenager. Luck was a little offended by this and the words. After that, he turned back to where the glass was. There, he saw his reflection and asked in amazement who this boy was. The angry man exclaimed that this was the guy. Lack couldn't believe that not only had 10 years passed, but he'd also become younger. It seemed like a joke. As Luck continued to stare at the reflection, the man told the boy that he seemed to have realized that the guild was no place for children. The man's friend asked him to be gentle. Lack wondered if it was because of the withering touch. He hadn't expected that to happen. The man was trying to shout to the boy, asking if he could hear him. Suddenly, someone noticed that the guildmaster had arrived. The man was shouting at Luck that if he thought he was going to get off that easy, he would throw him out. Suddenly, the stranger grabbed the man by the shoulder. He shouted that if the hero thought he was going to get off that easy, he would throw him out of here. Behind the man was Goblin, who was drowning in tears. He immediately ran forward, knocking down everything. With strong hands, he cleared a path for himself. Lack was delighted to see him. The guy tried to tell him something. Goblin quickly caught him and carried him out of the guild. While Lack said something in confusion, the amazed observers who were in the guild noticed that their master was crying. Once they got outside, Golan still couldn't stop crying. He hugged Lack with all his might, happy that he had survived and returned to them. The boy tried to get out of his arms. Blushing slightly, he asked his friend to stop crying. In response, Golan said he was not crying, although tears were flowing like a river. Lack, of course, was not indifferent when the girls cried, but he was more worried about the old man crying for him. He shouted at him again that Golan should not cry, but he again said that he was not crying. After a while, Golan gave Lack food and water. The happy boy talked about how delicious the pies they gave him were. Suddenly, Locke thought about it and asked how Golan knew that the boy was there. The man said that he was told that someone named Locke had come to him. He immediately thought that if it was his friend, he would go to the guild. Looking at Locke eating, he asked if his friend was hungry. Lack stated that he hadn't eaten for 10 years, so he was restoring energy with a draining touch, but his stomach felt like a black hole. Immediately after these words, Golan took away the buns. Lack asked what he was doing. Golan said that Lack couldn't eat it anymore. As Lack reached for the food, Golan asked who in their right mind would stuff their stomach with solid food after 10 years without eating. Lack insisted he was fine. Golan said that after everything his friend had been through, he couldn't let him die because of such stupidity. He immediately asked people to bring rice porridge. The angry guy looked at Golan. Suddenly, someone entered the room with a bowl of soup. He noticed that Locke was quite energetic. Golan smiled and noted that their guest had finally arrived. The man took off his robe, revealing Eric underneath. This meeting was surprising for both of them. Eric immediately approached and began to look at his friend. He noticed that, as Golan had said, even the ladies' man seemed to have aged. With tears in his eyes, Eric said that Locke had done well and returned to them. The boy was confused, because both his friends reacted the same way. He was worried about these two old men who were crying for him. Eric said with heaviness that 10 years had passed, and they thought that Locke had died. Locke said that he was finally home. He knew that these 10 years must have been a very long time for his friends. While Eric and Golan cried, Locke was glad that their trio of friends were finally together. He just hoped that they would stop crying soon. He thanked him for the food and said that he never thought he would say this, but the rice porridge was delicious. They cried again. Golan said he realized how long their friend had been hungry. They were sad because he had been starving for the sake of their world for 10 years. Luck said they were getting too sentimental. Eric came closer and said that after all, it had been 10 years. And yet, he noticed that Luck, surprisingly, hadn't aged at all. Golan also noticed this and said that, on the contrary, he began to look younger. Lack said that when he defeated the Demon Lord with Drain Touch, it seemed to have absorbed all of his life force. He guessed that it might be because of that. Seeing his friend's defeat, He asked what was wrong with his words. Eric and Golan asked together if Lack had managed to destroy the Demon Lord. Lack was confused and said that it was. He explained that the Demon Lord had recovered and attacked him, so he had no other choice. Golan and Eric looked at each other. They thought it was amazing that Lack had not only held off an army of demons, but had also single-handedly killed their master. They had thought that only an entire country's army could do that. Lack said they were exaggerating. Eric said he was serious. He said that his country was preparing for the Demon Lord's invasion, and he even had to increase their fighting strength. However, Lack killed him for them on his own. Golan laughed and said that they should prepare a suitable reward for him. King Eric agreed. Lack was surprised by this address, after which he asked if Eric had become the king of the country. The man confirmed this and said that he was awarded because of his merits in repelling the army of demons. At this moment, Lack remembered that Eric came from a royal family. Golan said that Eric is now the king of the country, and Golan himself is the Grand Master of the Adventurers Guild. Lack shook his head and said they seemed to have accomplished a lot. They asked him what he meant. Golan said that Lack was their savior, the great sage, the archmage, Archduke Lack Franzen. Lack did not understand this. He asked how he could be an archduke if he did not even know. He also asked what kind of surname he had. Eric reassured his friend and said that they were just trying to reward him for stopping the demon army in that way. He pointed to the statue and said that he had done that right after he had erected his monument. Lick also remembered seeing it. However, the boy also wondered why the other nobles were not against it, since it was such a high title. Eric said that no one was against it because Lack had no family or children. Luck also said that on top of everything else, everyone thought he was already dead. At that moment, a little sadness appeared on the faces of his friends. They confirmed it. Lack said it would be out of place if everyone knew he was alive. He also didn't want to get involved in all these games with the nobility. He clearly did not want assassins sent after him. Eric apologized to him and said that he had already come to an agreement that if Lack returned alive, he would at least receive the title of Earl. Lack realized that he seemed to have no choice but to become a noble. After this, the guy turned to Golan and said that he had a request. After that, a loud scream was heard. Golan couldn't believe that Lack was going to start over as an adventurer. The man was asking if Lack was in his right mind. He was asking if the mage was going to destroy his history as an S-rank adventurer. Eric was checking to see if his friend was okay. Lack had wanted to start over from scratch for a long time. Hearing this, Golan said that it was terribly boring. He said that something stronger would suit Lack. However, Lack had already made up his mind. He looked out into the street with enthusiasm. He said that if Golan was talking about rivals, the guy was tired of them. Friends looked at Lack with complicated expressions. They said that was true. Eric approached Golan and told him to fulfill this request. He said that Golan was the guildmaster, and there should be no problem with the restoration. Golan agreed and said that they could rely on him. It wasn't long before Golan gave Lack his new adventurer card. The guy looked at her carefully, then asked why his name was Rock. The man said that he made it so that only the guy's middle name would be visible. After that, he revealed that Lack's full name was now Lack Rock Franzen. The boy was a little surprised that he had been given a new name. Golan continued, telling that Lack was now an F-rank warrior by profession. He explained that now only Lack's second profession, warrior, would be visible. He said that they had hidden his main profession, and it was impossible to see it without a magical device that was in the guild headquarters. Golan also explained that the adventurer's card could not be forged, so no one would reveal Lack's identity. The boy apologized for having to do this. Golan smiled, then said that Lack should now rest. Eric supported him and said that he had many spare rooms at home. After listening to this, Lack thanked them again for such generous help. After that, Eric and Golan left, and the guy remained in the square. He turned around briefly and looked at the city, then set off as well. He thought that if he could get back, he could go on adventures with them again. Meanwhile, 10 years had already passed, and their position had changed in that time. From this moment, from this step, his new life as an adventurer, Rock begins. 3 whole days later, the city was quiet. While Golan was having breakfast, his butler informed the man that their guest was still sleeping. He asked worriedly if everything was all right. In response, the man told the butler not to worry about it and just let the guy rest. The butler accepted this order. Golan wiped away his tears. He was glad that Locke was finally okay. While the boy had already seen many dreams, Golan said that a man who had been fighting for the last 10 years could sleep peacefully. Someone was knocking loudly on the room door. The butler carefully knocked on the door, trying to shout to Rock. The boy rose from his bed with a heavy weight. Sleepily, he thought that he was very hungry. At the same time, he listened to the butler's cries outside the door. As soon as he noticed these sounds, he looked at the door. The butler was asking Rock if he was awake. At first, the guy didn't even understand who the butler was talking about, but he remembered what happened earlier and realized that this man was talking about him. Rock opened the door and said he was awake and asked if something was wrong. The butler let out a sigh of relief and said he was relieved the boy was alive. The boy said it was obvious he was alive. The boy said it was obvious he was alive. The butler countered that Rock hadn't left the room for a week, so he was worried. The butler explained that the owner had told him not to wake the boy no matter what happened, but he was still worried. Rock said that since it had been a week, he needed something to eat. Walking down the hall, Rock asked if Golan was there. The butler confirmed it and said that he was waiting for the boy in the dining room. Rock immediately turned to his friend and said that he was already awake. Golan was glad that he almost called him by his old name. He realized the mistake and told Rock that he must have disturbed him. Rock said that there was no need to worry, then asked if Golan was eating breakfast. He happily noted how delicious the food looked. However, as soon as Rock approached his seat, he saw the rice porridge again. Golan said that it was prepared especially for him. The guys thought that it might be because he had not eaten for a week. Golan immediately began asking the guy about what he would be doing today, and whether it was possible that he wanted to rest a little more. Rock refused and said that he had had enough rest and would look for a job in the guild. Golan supported his friend and told him not to overwork himself. Rock said that if he were to go on an adventure, he would need a new magic bag. Golan said that he had already prepared one for his friend. Rock happily said that Golan had helped him out. After some time, Rock collected all his belongings and set off on his way, straight to adventure. At the same time, an unfamiliar girl with blonde hair was diligently practicing fencing. With a sharp movement, she carried out many attacks on the area. After that, she stopped for a short break and took a towel to wipe off the sweat. At this time, she accidentally witnessed Rock leaving the estate. At this moment, the butler turned to the guy. The butler apologized deeply for his uncivil behavior that day. Rock said he was in war rags, and it was not the butler's fault. Without raising his head, the butler said he was deeply grateful to Rock for his kindness. After that, the guy waved his hand at him and left. The girl who had been silently watching this continued to look at the guy. As soon as Rock stepped outside, he almost immediately saw the statue of Locke. He looked at her and thought that he would probably never get used to this. At that moment, a small child suddenly fell behind the guy. The boy started crying loudly when suddenly his mother came up to him and said that this happens when a person doesn't look under his feet. She said that such a whiny child would never become a great man like Mr. Luck. After these words, the boy said that he would not cry anymore. The woman praised him, saying that he was a wonderful child. Hearing this, Rock blushed and walked away, thinking that he would have preferred that they had not used his name to teach children such a lesson. After some time, Rock successfully reached the main building of the Adventurers Guild. The guy carefully examined the list of tasks on the board. He thought that it didn't look like there were any orders for dragons and demons, so he concluded that the situation in the kingdom was quite calm. He squatted down and decided that in that case, he would look for newbie quests. If the quests had good rewards, he would have to share them with the real newbies. The guy pulled out some task that was difficult and the reward for it was small. He decided that it was just perfect for him. The hero approached the check-in counter. He was asked if he could cope alone. The young man answered that he could. The girl at the front desk asked if Rock knew that goblin-slaying missions were quite dangerous for lone adventurers. She said she couldn't let the boy go on them. Rock exclaimed that he knew about it, but everything would be fine. He was confident because he was actually an S-rank mage. The girl said that there were many newbies who died because they underestimated the goblins. Rock wanted to object to the girl again, but she approached him and sternly said that she was doing this for his own good. She told him to listen to what his older sister was saying. He thought that she seemed to be seriously worried about him, which led him to believe that she was a kind girl. Suddenly, someone behind them told Rock that, if he didn't mind, he could come along with them. Rock turned around and saw two adventurers. a boy and a girl. The guy said that they were both F-rank adventurers, just like Rock. He said that their party consisted of a mage and a scout, so they were missing someone in the vanguard. The girl asked if Rock was a warrior, and then offered to travel with him. The girl at the reception desk was happy about it. She immediately put the seal on it and asked if the two were destroying goblins. Rock turned around in shock and said that he hadn't actually given his consent. Even more sternly, the girl said that it would be better for the three of them to go together, since it would definitely be safer. Having no choice, Rock agreed. He turned to look at his companions. He sighed and said that he hoped they would get along. The guys also supported this idea. The guy said that his name was Ario, and he could use a fireball. The girl introduced herself as Genie and said that if Rock needed an Oka, he could rely on her. It turns out that Ario and Genie are brother and sister, and they are specialists in exterminating goblins in the countryside. Ario is 18 years old, and Genie is 17. They are even younger adventurers. Ario turned to Rock and asked if he was the same age as them. The boy thought that since he entered the interdimensional world at the age of 30 and fought for 30 years, he was now 40 years old. However, it is rather suspicious to be an F-rank adventurer at 40 years old. He turned away and said that he was a little older than the guys. Ario said admiringly that Rock looked quite young. After that, they walked further down the road in silence. Together, they walked deeper and deeper into the forest. And then it was deep night, and the dark sky was filled with bright stars. The boys stopped for the night. Rock looked at them and thought that it had been a while since he had set up camp. That was back when he was with Eric and Golan. But now it was different. He looked back towards the fire and saw Golan and Eric eating and drinking together by the fire. Just like in the old days, Rock looked in that direction and remained silent. The silence was broken by Genie, who asked Rock why he had taken the task of exterminating goblins. She asked if the boy knew that it was quite difficult and the pay was low. Rock remained silent, and then asked why they had accepted him. In response to this, the boys also fell silent, after which they told that their village was often attacked by goblins, but they were poor and could not afford to hire adventurers to protect them. That is why they took it upon themselves to destroy them. However, there are many places in the world other than their village that suffer from goblin attacks. That is why they have been working as adventurers for so long. Genie guessed that Rock probably took the task because he was worried about the farmers. Rock thought for a moment, then said that it was. Genie happily said that she thought so. The girl exclaimed that they should attack them decisively and save the villages. Rock thought that these two were good, and his job as an elder was to raise young adventurers like them. Rock thought he should be more careful than he usually was. The next day, the boys set out again. Genie stood by a passing freight coach in the village. The old woman who was driving it stopped next to her. Genie noted that the goblins had destroyed 2 months' worth of grain, 2 oxen, and 3 sheep. They often broke the fence to the west, and the attacks probably came from there. She said that this meant that their hideout was somewhere in the mountains, and given the range of the goblins, the hideout was quite close. Genie also said that the estimated number of goblins was 14. Ario agreed and said that the goblins must really be there. During this meeting, Rock listened to them silently, adding nothing. Genie sighed and said that they should go to the lair. Ario said that he would go after his sister. They set off again, exploring the surroundings of the village along the way. Noticing something unusual, the girl pointed to the side and said that they should go there. She also added that they seemed to be close. She called Rock to come with her. The guy noticed that Genie was a good scout, because she was good at reading tracks and quite smart. He thought that she did not look like an F-rank. However, the boy realized that they had made a mistake with the number of goblins. Genie had not been able to notice the camouflage tracks, of which there were more than 1,000. And besides, the most important thing was that goblins were not so smart as to hide their tracks. It only meant that there was someone who controlled these monsters. On the way, the guy turned to Ginny. The girl turned around and asked if something had happened. Rock sighed and told her not to worry. Everything was fine. He thought that when he was raising someone, he had to remember to let them figure it out for themselves. In the end, they all learned from their mistakes, especially when they were young. And yet, even though he didn't tell them, he had a responsibility. Rock couldn't let Ario and Genie die. After some time, they actually reached the goblin's lair. The boys thought it looked more like an old mine than a nest. They noticed 2 guards at the very entrance. Rock noticed that these tunnels were long and deep. and since they were very tangled, there was a chance that they would be ambushed. Rock knew that the chances were even higher if there were many of them. Rock said that it would be difficult. The boys, confused, asked if he really thought so. Ario said that there would only be 14 of them. Rock knew he could turn them all to dust with just his spell, but he also wanted Genie and Ario to gain experience. Somewhat confused, Genie asked what they should do. Ario suggested that they should just be more careful. The girl agreed and said that it would be dangerous if they underestimated the goblins. Rock stood up and said that he would go ahead, so they should cover him with a bow and magic. The boys accepted this request. The next moment, Rock took off. By the time the goblin noticed the guy, Rock had already cut off his head. Rock thought he would start with one. While one of the guards fell dead, the second only managed to notice that something had happened. Rock realized that he could have killed both of them with one blow, but decided to leave the second one. As the guy expected, the second one did not stay alive for long. A few moments later, Genie shot him in the head, after which he also fell. As soon as this happened, Rock waved his hand to the boys to let them know that they could go forward. As they got closer, Rock declared that Genie's archery was simply superb. The girl also noted that Rock's speed was incredible. After finishing his compliments, Rock told Genie to make sure he wasn't attacked from behind. The girl said he could rely on her. Rock then told Ario to follow him. They walked deeper into the tunnel together, with Genie constantly looking back. In just an instant, both Ario and Genie began to attack the monsters that appeared next to them. Rock just looked at this in surprise, sword in hand. After a long battle, the tired boys noticed that there were many more goblins than they had previously expected. Tired, Genie said that they had killed 30 goblins already. Ario fell on his back and asked what was going on in his place. Rock, who had expected this, ate an apple in silence. Suddenly, he said that there were definitely a lot of them. The guy also said that there were definitely a lot of them. The guy also said that there was a possibility that someone was controlling such a huge horde of goblins. Ario, shocked by his comrade's words, could only guess what Rock was trying to say. The boy asked if Ario could use another fireball. Ario said that if he exerted himself, but it seemed he had already reached his limit. Rock asked how many arrows Genie had left, to which the girl replied that there were only 3. After these words, a heavy silence fell in the room. With great heaviness, Ario suggested that they all retreat. Rock thought that the guy had made the right decision. Genie tried to say something against it, but Ario said that such a horde was most likely led by a hobgoblin or a goblin mage. He knew that going without arrows or mana was foolish. Suddenly, a terrifying scream of a monster echoed throughout the cave, immediately attracting everyone's attention. Ario and Genie were frightened and asked if the monster was coming straight towards them. The next moment, the monster's huge foot stepped onto the ground in front of them. A goblin of astonishing size stood before them, the veins on his arms bulging, and he held a huge weapon. The boys managed to hide, so they looked at the monster from the side in horror. Suddenly, the monster turned to the side, examining its surroundings. Rock covered his mouth with his hand, indicating that the boys should be quiet, and then said that this monster seemed to be a goblin overlord. The boy exclaimed in horror that this was clearly not a suitable opponent for their F rank. Even veterans of the C rank would not be able to cope. Genie asked what they should do. Continuing to hide behind the wall, Rock thought that the goblin lord had appeared unexpectedly, but he knew for sure that he could deal with him without any problems. However, they still had one problem. Noticing the pile of dead goblins lying on the ground, the goblin lord screamed loudly. Rock quickly realized that this monster did not look like someone who could give smart advice to goblins. The boy decided that there must be an even more powerful monster behind this one. At that moment, someone unknown with a weapon in his hands rushed at the monster with a loud cry. A girl with an animal's tail and ears rushed at the monster. The girl quickly wounded the goblin and jumped back. The next moment, the monster swung his weapon hard and hit the ground, but it hit the ground. He looked up and saw that the girl he wanted to attack was on the ceiling. The unknown woman said that this monster was just a small and weak goblin. Using her blade, the girl severely wounded the monster, slightly cutting its body into pieces. She thought that someone like that shouldn't stand in her way. As soon as this attack reached the monster, blood flowed from its eyes and it screamed in pain. The girl thought that she barely hit it with her attack. She landed on the floor and prepared for the next attacks. The guys watching this were amazed. Ario could not contain his admiration. With her sensitive hearing, the girl heard Ario's words and then shouted at them to leave now while there was still time. Rock stepped forward to join the battle. He also told Aryo and Genie to run away. Without fully understanding the situation, Aryo agreed. The boys turned around asking Rock why he was staying, but he was in no mood for conversation. Suddenly, a loud bang was heard in the air. The girl held the monster's weapon, furiously telling the goblin that he would not dare pass by her. Rock, who chose to stay, asked the girl if he should help her. Hearing someone's voice, the shocked girl could not believe her ears. She turned around and asked in surprise why Rock hadn't run away yet. In response, the guy calmly stated that he stayed because he could help her. The girl continued to fight, saying that in that case, Rock should just stand and not interfere with her in the battle. After listening to the girl, Rock simply stood up, watching her fight. The guy said he would do as she said, but at this rate, she would simply lose. Hearing these things, the angry girl turned around and asked if the guy could really say that she was weaker than this stupid monster. Rock sighed and stated that this was not what he wanted to say. The next moment, the goblin broke the girl's weapon, which greatly surprised her. Rock smugly pointed out what had just happened, and said that the stranger's sword was not strong enough to withstand such an attack. Not knowing what to do, the girl sighed loudly and landed on the ground, already preparing for the monster's next attack. Rock put down his weapon and sat down, then asked again if he should help her. The girl hissed angrily at him that she was fine and that he should run away quickly. The next moment, the girl pulled out her dagger from behind her back and with a loud cry, rushed to attack the goblin again. Without much effort, the monster swung again. With a sharp movement, he knocked the weapon out of the girl's hands, leaving her without any means of defense. They landed on the ground. The monster began to swing its weapon in order to kill the girl, who could only rub her hand, which was in terrible pain after the previous attack. Just as the girl was about to die at the hands of the goblin overlord, Rock stood right in front of her, protecting her. The amazed girl asked what he was doing in front of her. Rock calmly said that he would no longer ask her whether she wanted it or not, but would simply help her himself. With a deft and careful movement, the guy pulled out a huge sword and took it in his hands. While the girl sat behind him, Rock just grinned and told the monster to attack him. Rock and the goblin made eye contact, which angered the monster quite a bit. The goblin bared his teeth at the boy, then screamed loudly, releasing all his strength. His scream was so loud that the girl even had to cover her ears with her hands to keep from losing her hearing. The monster approached Rock to kill the annoying guy. At this time, the adventurer was completely calm. The guy gracefully attacked the monster with his sword, cutting the goblin into several equal parts. At the same time, he said that this monster was making too much noise. The amazed girl just watched in silence as Rock dealt so well with this powerful enemy. After this attack, parts of the monster's body began to fall to the ground with a crack, producing not the most pleasant sounds and sights. Rock smiled sweetly and turned slightly, asking if the girl he had just saved was hurt. At this time, the girl looked at what was left of the goblin. She was amazed by what she had just seen. At first, she wanted to ask who asked Rock to do this, but she realized that she was much more interested in who this guy was. Carrying this question, Rock lowered his head with some pride, then declared that he was an ordinary, F-rank adventurer who was passing by. With all due respect to her savior, the girl simply could not believe such a brazen lie. Wanting to prove that he was truly an ordinary F-rank adventurer, he pulled out his card. The girl was even more surprised that Rock turned out to be an ordinary guy. The proud guy raised his head and asked if she would believe him now. The girl did not quite understand why this strange man was so proud of his F-ranks. Suddenly, the girl remembered that she had completely forgotten to introduce herself. She apologized for her rude behavior. The girl politely knelt down, then smiled sweetly and said that she was the daughter of Danton, the chieftain of the beastman tribe, and her name was Shia. The girl bowed deeply and said that she was truly grateful for saving her. Rock began to feel shy and said that she was truly grateful for saving her. Rock began to feel shy and said that she did not need to be so modest. Shia continued, saying that, on top of everything else, she should apologize for being so rude earlier. The guy was very surprised by her words. She said that she, not realizing the full power of Rock, ordered him to run away. She said that she acted very shamelessly. Her ears drooped as she said with a guilty expression that she was very ashamed. Rock asked in shock if that was really the case. He asked the girl not to think about it. Shay tried to object, but Rock did not let her continue. He said that she thought he was a newbie and gave him a chance to escape. Shia confirmed this. Rock continued, saying that she did the same thing any adventurer would do if he were in her place. The friendly guy extended his hand to her and said that his name was Rock. The guy also added that he was a veteran of the F rank. Shia smiled sweetly and took his hand, asking what that could mean. Suddenly, Rock remembered something and asked the calm girl if there was anyone else there. Hearing this question, Shia suddenly turned pale. Rock said he was sure this enemy would be stronger than the Goblin Lord. He walked to the edge where there was a huge room with a staircase. He said someone had to be there. At this time, a bat was watching the boys, but it remained unnoticed. The animal calmly watched them with its eyes. As it turned out, at that very moment, the beautiful woman was speaking with a little surprise about the fact that these guys seemed to be coming to her to sacrifice themselves. She wanted these pathetic people to become food for her cursed medallion. The entire ground around the girl, wrapped in huge bat wings, was littered with human bodies. Shia looked away and asked what Rock meant. As she said these words, her small ears were shaking and her gaze was darting around. Rock reminded her that earlier, the girl had shouted that the monster was just a weak fool. He concluded that this meant that there was someone else here who would be stronger than him. Shia didn't know what to say to that, so she looked away. Without waiting for an answer, Rock said that everything would be as Shia wanted, and if she didn't want to talk about it, then she shouldn't. At that moment, the guy jumped up. Rock said that the enemy was most likely on the bottom floor. As he walked down the stairs, Rock said that the order he had accepted only spoke of goblins. But if there was someone strong, he could not ignore it for the sake of the villages nearby. He turned around proudly and said that this was the reason he was going to defeat this enemy. Hearing this speech, the girl was amazed by Rock's mood, but her mood quickly changed to worry. Shia said that Rock really has an amazing willpower, but this is clearly not an opponent that he can defeat with just this willpower. The girl said with heaviness that their enemy was a vampire lord. Hearing this, Rock became quite tense. Shia explained that her tribe had hunted vampires for generations, and yet the vampire that her father had failed to defeat had recently reappeared. The girl explained that this vampire was the vampire ward. Rock pointed to the pit and asked if the monster was there. Shia stated that they found it months later. Rock took this information, then calmly turned away and walked on. Shia repeated that their enemy was a vampire lord. Rock calmly said that he was not sure if he should say that, then asked if the vampire lord was stronger than the goblin lord that Shia had never been able to defeat. The girl couldn't answer that. Shia lowered her head and said in a complicated manner that even if it was so, she was the chieftain's daughter, and she had to wash away the shame from their tribe. Hearing this, Rock smiled, looking at the girl's strength. Rock asked if this shame meant they couldn't work together. Shia said it was okay if someone helped her, because she could still wash away their shame. Hearing this, Rock said it was okay then. Right after that, the guy handed her the hilt of his sword, which surprised Shia quite a bit. The girl looked grateful as she looked at the weapon that Rock handed her. Rock stated that she couldn't fight without a sword, so he could lend her his. The proud and confident boy stated that he was strong even without a weapon. He began waving his arms. Watching this, Shia simply remained silent. Looking at the sword, Shia said that she was very grateful to Rock. The girl understood that by giving her his sword, his main weapon, Rock was telling her that she must defeat the vampire lord with her own hands. She thought that was exactly what he wanted to say. As Rock killed the small goblins they encountered along the way, she thought that this was just what she was hoping for. At the same time, Rock was killing goblins like flies with his bare hands. Looking at this, Shia was truly amazed. Noticing the next goblin, Rock ran towards him and then destroyed the goblin with just one kick. At the very moment when there were no enemies left around them to fear, Rock waved his hands, getting rid of the blood on his hands. Looking at this, Shia simply did not understand how this was possible. While the smug Rock asked if the girl saw this, Shia thought that he really was strong. In such small battles, the guys managed to get to the monster, who was already waiting for them below. With a quick movement, Shia knocked down the door, behind which the vampire lord was waiting for them. The vampire smiled widely, then said that this girl dared to enter her bedchamber without wiping her dirty feet. He stated that this little girl had no manners. At this time, Shia began to hiss, saying that she had found her, the vampire lord. and she would destroy this monster with her own hands. Hearing this, the monster only smiled. He said that despite the fact that even her father's squad had to work hard just to wound him, Shia dared to say that someone weaker could defeat him. He lifted his hair from his face and said that it was just funny. Then he smiled widely, without removing his hand from his face. Suddenly, the laughter turned to rage, and the vampire lord exclaimed that Shia should not underestimate him. He raised his hands and said that for Shia to bare her fangs at him, the lord of the night, she would die, regretting it. Suddenly the vampire said that after all, Shia had done something good, because she had brought this man here. He said that he should be grateful to her for that. Surprised, Shia asked what he was talking about. The vampire lord said that the girl's people were dogs, and they were immune to the vampire's charms. He smirked and said that if it was a normal person, they could turn him into their slave using their magic. Hearing this, Shia realized that she had made a terrible mistake. She turned to Rock and shouted at him to get out of there. The vampire created magic circles with his eyes and said that it was too late. Using a powerful spell, this vampire took Doom's consciousness. Suddenly, Rock's eyes became cloudy. Shia tried to call out to her new friend, but he didn't answer her. The monster grinned and told Rock to come to him. Obeying this order, Rock walked forward, stepping on the bones and skulls of the people who had once been here before him. The girl tried to stop the guy, but he didn't hear her. Realizing what was happening, Shia fell to her knees in despair. She realized that she had made a terrible mistake. Shia did not even understand how she could forget about the charms of vampires, because there is no one who can resist the charms of a vampire lord. Smiling widely, he said that Shia should choose by whose hand she will die, after which he said that she can die because of Rock or because of him. Unexpectedly for everyone in that small room at that moment, Rock took charge of the situation and swung his fist hard to attack the monster. The vampire didn't even have time to process the situation that happened right in front of his face. In just one moment, he received a strong blow to the face. Immediately after that, streams of blood flowed from his eyes, mouth, and nose. Rock didn't stop after one blow, wanting to show this vampire who he was. He hit the vampire in the face again and then sent the monster flying far back. Both Shia and the vampire were shocked by this turn of events. The monster began to groan heavily, saying that this was simply impossible. At that moment, blood was flowing from his entire face. The vampire asked why his charms didn't work on Rock, who he thought was just a normal human. The monster screamed loudly that the guy shouldn't lie so brazenly to his face, because there simply couldn't be a human who could resist the vampire lord's incredible charms. Rock laughed loudly and said that the monster must not have been a vampire lord. He said that he meant that the monster was just an ordinary vampire who thought he was a vampire lord. Shia thought that Rock was just making fun of the monster. Not wanting to hear such blatant insults, the monster cursed at Rock. The vampire lowered his hands to the ground, after which a huge black mass began to spread from them. It began to move straight along the ground towards Rock. Noticing this, the guy became wary. The vampire smiled cruelly and said that Rock could only repent for his mockery. In an instant, this dark something began to surround Rock. Suddenly, the thicket turned into sharp spikes that were close to attacking Rock. However, the guy did not lose his head. He smiled and used a magic circle to dodge the attack. Shia looked closely at the magic circle and was quite surprised because Rock used a high-level magic circle. Using another magic circle with the power of air, Rock quickly pushed off and rushed straight at the monster with acceleration. Rock deftly grabbed the vampire by the throat. He smirked and said that he should show this vampire how magic was different from the pathetic spell he used on him. At that moment, Rock began to create a magic circle to hit the vampire. Watching this, the monster recognized the spell. A look of pure horror appeared on his face. Rock touched the monster's body and used the withering touch he had acquired during the hard battles in the interdimensional rift. The monster screamed loudly, experiencing terrible pain. Its entire body began to twist into a funnel. Its screams were so loud and piercing that Shia could not even tear her eyes away from this terrifying sight that opened up right in front of her. After the spell was completed, the monster could only silently stare at the sky. Suddenly, he created a sword from the remains of his own flesh and tried to attack Rock, but the boy quickly jumped back, dodging the unexpected attack. For Rock, this was not something difficult. The boy declared that this vampire was the weakest of all. Having lost more than half of his strength, the vampire asked Rock who he even was. In response, the boy calmly said that he was just his friendly neighbor, an F-rank adventurer named Rock. The monster screamed loudly, calling on the boy not to lie to him so brazenly. After that, he fell silent. The vampire said that this was also quite normal. The colors of some despair and madness were already playing on his face. The vampire began to envelop everything with his power and screamed that he would never forget the anger that Rock had awakened in him. He told Rock to always remember that he would never have a single good night again. At that moment, the vampire began to divide his body into many bats, which began to fly away in all possible directions. The guy realized that the vampire was trying to escape right under his nose. At that moment, the reason why the vampire family lived so long became clear to him. The vampire raised his hand and wanted to do something, but all those mice that now made up his body were dying quickly. In an instant, the bats that were nearby also began to disperse, turning into dust. Rock watched all this with great interest. He also noticed that the bats were turning to ash. He expected nothing less from the sword he had received for defeating the demon lord. Meanwhile, Shia continued to strike the disappearing vampire with her sword. After each strike, the monster screamed, and most of his bats turned to ash. After a while, almost all of the bats turned to ashes. Starting from their bodies, they disintegrated into small grains of sand, and in the end, only the wings remained, which awaited the same fate. Shia stood silently and watched as the vampire's body disintegrated, and only his head lay on the ground. She held the sword that had almost killed the monster. The vampire who had previously thought he was a lord looked up, his eyes full of crimson liquid, and said with a heavy voice that he had been struck down. It was hard for him to admit it, but there was almost no curse left in the medallion. Quite pleased with the situation, Rock asked with a smile on his face if this would cleanse the Shia tribe of shame. The girl smiled broadly and said that it would be enough, after which she sincerely thanked Rock for his help. The boy noted that this weapon seemed to be useful to her. Shia noted that this weapon seemed to be useful to her. Shia noted that this sword was very sharp. Rock was confused by such attention and exclaimed that it was only Shia's imagination. Remembering about absorbing powers, Shia noticed and told Rock that he had just said something like a withering touch. This interested the girl. Rock tensed up even more and asked if the girl was going to take the vampire's head back to her village. She knelt down and said that there was no need for that. She picked up the first stick she could find on the ground and began digging through the ashes that were left by the vampire. Within moments, Shia stood up, holding a rather frightening artifact that emitted dark energy. Shia explained that it was a cursed medallion that was usually buried with the body of a vampire lord. She also added that when a vampire drinks blood, the curse in the medallion is greatly enhanced. The guy even wondered if this could be a new fashion trend among vampires. Suddenly, the boys were torn away from their conversation by a sinister laugh that came from the head of the already defeated vampire. This rather tensed Shia, while Rock only looked in that direction with interest. The vampire said that very soon the gates to the spatial rift would open, all thanks to the power of this terrifying medallion. The vampire exclaimed that once these gates opened, the world would be filled with countless demons who were part of the demon lord's army. The vampire had already presented a picture of a destroyed world. He said that after the invasion of the demon army, their gods would descend into this world from another dimension. These must be the dark gods of the underworld. Hearing such news, Shia tensed up and her ears perked up. The girl listened attentively to what this monster was saying. At the same time, Rock did not show any emotion. The guy only listened to what the vampire was saying. The monster laughed loudly and said that now they would live in endless fear, waiting for that day to come. Sooner or later, many vampire lords would come to the call of the medallion and destroy the village of Shia. That's what the monster was talking about. He scared the girl that her entire clan would become prey to these terrible demons. The monster seriously scared the poor girl with his story. At that moment, Rock decided to take the sinister medallion. With one hand, he quickly threw the medallion into the air so that it spun like an ordinary coin. Right after that, the guy swung his sword, all in order to destroy the medallion before it could cause any problems. After Rock's first attack, the medallion split into two identical parts, like a sheet of paper. The guy managed to do this without much effort. Suddenly, all the power that came out of the dark medallion began to enter the Sword of Doom. The weapon absorbed more and more dark energy. At the same time, the vampire was incredibly amazed by what he had just seen. He did not understand that only one weapon could absorb all the curses that were in this medallion, because he had been saving them for a long time. The amazed monster asked what kind of sword it was. Holding the weapon on his shoulders, Rock reminded him of what the vampire had just said. He had stated that even if the gates were to open, no demon would come to this world. Rock calmly said that no one would come to this world. Rock calmly said that no one would come because he had already destroyed every single demon. The vampire, shocked by these words, could not even answer. Suddenly, something terrible dawned on the monster, and he seemed to understand what kind of sword was in Rock's hands. Drops of cold sweat began to appear on the vampire's face, formed due to fear. Rock cut the monster's head into 2 equal parts. Considering what the vampire had just said, Shia could also guess who Rock was, who had saved her just recently. The girl became scared and began to move away from him, asking along the way if her companion's real name was Luck. The guy paused for a moment after this question, not knowing what to say. Rock decided to turn to Shia after all. In a small turn, he smiled slightly and put his finger to his mouth, saying that this was his little secret. Hearing this, the girl smiled widely, clearly feeling relieved. She was simply glad that her companion was not a demon or the same monster as the vampire he had just killed. After that, the boys walked back to the street together. Shia said that after she looked at him again, she definitely saw that the guy looked like the statue of the hero Lack, which stands in the city square. Rock awkwardly but confidently objected. The girl said that Rock was talking nonsense, and he really looked like this statue. Lack walked up to the reception desk, where both new and seasoned adventurers were usually received. The guy took out his bag and began pouring out what he'd collected on his trip. It was a pile of magic stones that the boy had managed to get by fighting the goblins. Lack smiled, pointing to such a large, even obscene amount. Lack continued to look at the girl with a smile, who immediately became embarrassed by such a large amount of work. Locke wanted her to appreciate them, and the worker immediately began to call for help from Senpai. Another girl came up and saw the pile of magic stones. She smiled at Luck, saying that the boy, apparently, returned safe and sound. After looking at the resources, she immediately said that there were too many of them, in the girl's opinion. Lack's companion said that the goblin horde was much larger than expected. Fortunately, the B-rank adventurer, Shia, was nearby. Together, they were able to cope. Shia also smiled widely and said that Lack's company was really lucky to have her. The guild worker also smiled and said that it was indeed luck. Then the girl added that it was a miscalculation on the part of the guild, and she, on behalf of the headquarters, apologized to the guys. In reality, the boys had prepared a cover story from the start. After defeating the vampire lord, they joined Ario and Genie. Shia and Lack hid his identity when they explained what had happened, that the goblins were the vampire lord's henchmen, that Lack's party had been lured there, and that Shia had pursued the vampire lord in order to clear the honor of her tribe. They also didn't say anything about that. In order to hide Lack's identity, the guy said that he was simply an outstanding adventurer who had some circumstances to hide his abilities. Ario and Genie, when they saw and heard all this, were very surprised, but because of everything that had happened, they believed Lack and his story. Shia had brilliantly defeated the vampire lord himself, which the boys hadn't said right away either. But since he could cause problems for the guild, it was decided that Shia would report him herself. When Shia entered, the whole company immediately started shouting to her, letting her know where Lack, Ario, and Genie were sitting. The girl smiled and headed towards them. Shia was the last one to finish her report. When she approached, Luck immediately asked about it. The girl said that she had done well, adding that the guild was also going to take some measures to destroy the vampire lord. The girl turned to Luck, wanting to tell him something. The guy calmly drank his drink, like the others, continuing to rejoice that they were able to save the village. Shia caught Lack's attention and pulled out a small piece of metal from her pocket. It was half of a cursed medallion. The girl said that she gave the other half to the guild. Lack looked at her in surprise and asked if this was a good idea in Shia's opinion. She smiled and said that as long as there was a second half, Shia could prove that she had cleared the honor of her tribe. Laka was quite satisfied with this answer and continued to look at the girl with a satisfied and calm look. Shia added that, in her opinion, this part might be needed when they report what happened. Lak let out a sigh of relief, continuing to let go of this difficult day, and then told her to keep the other half for now. Aryo stood up a little and asked Shay to have a drink together. Time flew by pretty quickly, but more importantly, they had a lot of fun together. Soon they went outside and Aryo, who was well drunk, started saying that he was in a great mood, remembered something, and he and Ginny separated a little, kneeling and putting their hands behind their heads. Lak was a little surprised by what was happening. The guy looked towards the guys, and Aryo, noticing this, said that Lak should also show his respect. Afterwards, Aryo raised his head and said that this honor goes to the great hero Lak. Of course, they did not yet know that the one they called Rock was Laksama. Aryo continued to talk about how they were able to fulfill the guild's order without much difficulty, no doubt due to Lak's divine protection. Lak himself stood there with a stupid expression at this moment. Aryo and Ginny continued to kneel, praying to the great hero. Aryo said that Lak is the hero, thanks to whom they are now living and enjoying this world every day. Lak stood there, embarrassed, not even knowing how he could react to all this. Shia stood behind the guy and quietly chuckled, also slightly embarrassed. Shia, as if to further embarrass Lak, said that she agreed with the boys. They were all definitely under Lak's divine protection on their mission. Jeannie said in a low voice that she knew. She also assumed that Shay would understand the boys and join in. Shay stepped forward, holding back her laughter, and said that she too should pay her respects to Luck. After this little introduction, Aryo and Jeannie waved to the boys and said that they would definitely see each other again. Shay and Luck smiled back and confirmed that their meeting would take place. She watched Aryo and Jeannie walk away, swaying slightly. Shay noticed that the boys, though shy and timid, understood how lucky they were. The girl smiled and said that they would become great adventurers, and then immediately asked Lak's opinion on this matter. The guy said that it was so, and besides, he was glad that everything was okay with them. Shia scratched her arm awkwardly and said that if you look at it that way, she was in a similar situation. The girl added that if it weren't for Luck, who knows what would have happened to her. Lak replied that thanks to Shia, he was able to learn about vampire patterns, so they were in the same boat. The pattern was like a certain image, giving a general understanding of the picture and thinking. Shia, in response to this, smiled widely and told the guy not to dare to imitate her. Laughing, she said that this was starting to embarrass her a lot. Lak raised his index finger and said that they could do the following. Shia could share with him the information that her tribe had about vampires. Lak confidently said that if the vampire's goal was to open an interdimensional rift and summon the dark gods, then it would no longer be a problem just for the beastmen. The boy clenched his fist and said in a louder tone that he would never allow the world they had finally managed to protect to be destroyed before their eyes. The girl, looking at all this, opened her eyes wide, amazed by Lak's words. Against the background of the statue, all this seemed even more majestic. Lak turned to her and asked what was wrong. The girl said loudly, pointing to the statue of Locke, that she had always known this. She noticed that Locke really did look like this erected statue. Luck just laughed, looking away, and said that the girl understood perfectly well that Luck himself looked different. Shay added that it was something completely different, which was difficult to explain. Without saying anything further, Shia smiled shyly, slightly pressing her ears. The girl looked down and thought that she was actually very glad that Luck was on their side in this great confrontation. Afterwards, Shia began to move away in the other direction, shouting along the way that in that case, she would quickly return to her village and gather the information that Lak needed. Afterwards, she promised to return. Lak said that if the girl found out anything, she would be able to find him in Golan's estate. Looking at the medallion, the guy thought that he expected nothing less from the beastman. Clutching half of it tightly in his hand, the boy thought that he should report this to Golan. The Adventurers Guild is a large organization. The larger the organization, the longer it takes to make decisions. That's why Locke thought it would take a long time before word of the vampires reached Golan's ears. The vampire lords themselves weren't that scary, but their plan was very dangerous. If they found out about it later, it could have been fatal. It was probably not easy for Shia to report this to the guild, and also to entrust this medallion to Laku. When Lack returned home, he immediately announced it, standing in the doorway. The guy continued to think that he should live up to the expectations placed on him. Suddenly, Golan flew up to him. Golan started cursing, saying that Lack thought it was okay to disappear from home for 3 days after saying he was only going out for a short walk. Golan also added that Lack had really made him worry. The man also added that if the boy was late, he could at least report it. Lake thought that Golan was acting like his mother. However, there were more important matters, so Lack himself did not focus on this. He showed the medallion, saying that Golan would forgive him when he heard the stories of his journey. As they sat down in the warm, fireplace-heated room, Luck placed half of the cursed medallion on the table with a crisp thud and pushed it towards Golan, saying that this was rather disturbing news. Golan immediately became excited and a slight sweat began to run down his face. The man was very surprised to see this, and then asked what their plan was. Luck leaned back slightly and exhaled. The guy said that if you think about it, the Demon Lord was just the vanguard of the dark gods. Then he was just joking. Golan examined the object carefully, then asked Lack if he could take it and test it with a special machine. Lack said he would be fine with it. Lack began to walk away, saying that he was going to contact the owner of this medallion, Shia. Golan said that he understood everything, so in that case he would inform the gatekeeper. When Lack was about to leave, Golan called out to him. Lack turned around, and the man said words of gratitude to him as a guildmaster. Golan thanked him for saving the newbies. Lack felt a little awkward looking at his old friend who was now groveling in front of him. The guy told Golan not to worry, continuing to hold on to the door handle. Suddenly, the door opened unexpectedly, which scared Lack a lot. The guy didn't have time to turn around completely, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw the silhouette of a girl coming out of the dark room into the light. It was a very beautiful, well-dressed girl with long, light hair, like Golan's. Their eyes were also the same color, but Lack did not immediately notice it. Golan called out to the girl, calling her Solaris. The man said that she had come in just in time. All this time, Solaris had been looking at the silent Lack with a rather hostile expression. Having studied the dark-haired young man, the girl snorted and turned her head away, passing by. Lack continued to watch her closely, looking after her. The only sounds in the room now were the crackling fireplace and the clicking of Solaris's short heels. Having come to his senses a little, Luck extended his hand and asked who this girl was. Golan put his hands together and said quietly that this was his daughter, Solaris. He also added that she would soon be 15. Luck said that he had apparently done something very wrong to her. Golan rolled his eyes slightly and said that it was his fault. The man hadn't let her become an adventurer. Luck didn't believe that Golan was against it, to which Golan replied that if you forget that he was her father, the girl was quite suitable for the job. Afterwards, Golan closed his eyes and said that Solaris was still a child. He also added that the girl needed caution and knowledge to be an adventurer. Lack said that everything Golan was talking about now could only be achieved with experience. Then the guy shared an observation, saying that Golan was overprotective of her. Golan exhaled nervously and said that he should consult with his wife before making such decisions. But now she was away on business in a neighboring country. Lack thought that he had never even met Golan's wife. If you think about it. Golan was silent for a while, and then turned to the guy saying that he had a small favor to ask. The next day, Luck noticed something while he was drinking his hour and studying another book on the magical arts. The guy saw how outside the window, in the courtyard, Solaris was training. Looking closely, Lack could tell that the girl had a certain talent. In this respect, she even looked very much like her father, Golan. Golan's words echoed in Lack's mind, the words he had spoken to him the night before. The old friend knew that at this rate his daughter would simply go and register as an adventurer, and then set off on her own. Golan knew he couldn't stop it in any way. That's why he wanted Luck to keep an eye on the girl. Luck closed his book and continued thinking about it, when he noticed Solaris's gaze on him. Glancing carefully at the girl, Luck thought that he knew it very well. He realized that the girl had been looking at him all this time, and her face had retained its displeasure. After Luck himself had studied and read for a while, the boy went to dinner, which the courtiers had already prepared. The boy eagerly pounced on the food when he noticed that Solaris was also entering the living room. The girl entered the room, continuing to adjust her appearance after a hard workout. The maid immediately asked her mistress how many cakes the girl would like. Solaris continued to approach the table all this time, after which the second courtier helped her sit down by moving her chair. Golan's daughter said that she would have 3 pieces, after which she sat down opposite Locke. As soon as the girl sat down, in her usual manner for Locke, she glared at him, immediately disturbing the young man's peace. Locke asked a little nervously, thinking that he had something on his face. Solaris, without taking her eyes off him, remained silent for a while, and then slowly began her address, maintaining the intrigue. Locke thought that now the culmination would happen. The longer Solaris dragged it out, the more uneasy Locke became. The guy had already started trying to rush her somehow, thinking that she probably found out about his real identity. Suddenly, the girl said something that neither Locke nor the courtiers nearby expected. She pointed her finger at the young man and shouted that he was his father's illegitimate son. The courtiers almost fell over, carrying a half-empty tray of dishes. The girl continued to watch intently as Locke wiped his mouth, after which she said inquisitively that she, apparently, guessed right away, because Locke was speechless. After she started to press, Locke immediately began to justify himself, saying that everything was absolutely wrong. It had never occurred to him that he would be considered Golan's illegitimate son. But to the girl, it seemed that everything was elementary and simple. She began to advance her theory, saying that firstly, the father waited until the mother was not home, and then immediately brought the guy here. Secondly, what also seemed very strange to Solaris was that her father, Golan, looked very strange after the guy showed up at their house. And finally, thirdly, while Locke was away from home for 3 whole days, Dad was restless the whole time. Dad walked around the house, continuing to be indignant, and also worked the whole night, waiting for his return. Locke felt a little ashamed of his friend's behavior in front of his daughter. He thought that Solaris might have been wrong with her conclusions, but the facts spoke otherwise and they were quite difficult to refute. Suddenly, the guy heard the girl start sniffling. He looked at her, but at that moment, Solaris had already lowered her head, hiding her eyes, where tears were forming. The girl began to talk about how her father could have acted so recklessly. The thought flashed through Locke's mind that this could lead to the breakup of the Golan family. The girl continued to sob quietly, not letting all her emotions come out at once. Locke watched her closely, trying to come up with something to justify himself. But for now, Locke felt the butler's gaze on him, as if asking him to give him something already. This butler, who seemed to recognize the guy's identity, because he had a simply chilling gaze. So, Locke understood that he needed to act, and the most important thing was to just start talking. And as for what? He could get his bearings as the dialogue progressed. The young man said that he had something on this matter. Locke began to speak at length and said that he was, in fact, a friend of Golan, who was also 40 years old. The girl was indignant, after which she loudly shouted that this was a complete lie. Even though she was only 14, Solaris didn't allow anyone to treat her like a child or deceive her. The girl looked gloomily at Locke and asked where he looked 40 years old. At this point, Locke became indignant and realized that he was driven into a stupor. The girl sighed and put her hand to her head and drawled that Locke was probably her older brother. Locke scratched his head and said that it was not so. The girl began to say that there was another option in that case. Locke already believed that she was beginning to understand, after which Solaris said that then he was the younger brother. Locke pulled out a card and handed it to the girl, shouting out what she had to say about it. It was an adventurer's card, where the guy was introduced as a certain rock. Locke began to say sternly that her father's name, Lord Golan Morton, did not appear anywhere on this map. Therefore, in Locke's opinion, this could only mean one thing. The girl was horrified, saying that her father apparently didn't even acknowledge his illegitimate son. Locke rolled his eyes, not understanding how Solaris even came to such conclusions. The girl began to nervously tap her heels under the table, after which she immediately uttered words of apology towards Locke. She immediately took out a handkerchief and began to cry. The girl, slightly stuttering, said that Locke must have suffered because of their father. The girl also said that he had done nothing wrong and could now call Solaris his big sister. Locke was in complete shock that the girl flatly refused to understand him, and even seemed to hear him. He continued to look at her with wide-open eyes, already completely ignoring the butler behind him. As soon as Locke began to try to explain himself again, turning to Solaris, the girl immediately corrected him, telling him to call her his older sister from now on. Locke was already starting to lose his temper. His whole body was shaking with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists. Still nervous, but still holding back, the guy called the girl big sister through his teeth. Solaris responded immediately, smiling and asking what Rock wanted to talk about. The girl immediately made it clear that if it was about his confession, she would talk to her mother. But Solaris immediately made it clear that after such a conversation, her mother would most likely get angry and tie up her father, and the girl would give him a good spanking. Lack thought that the conversation was again about the collapse of the Golan family. The boy glanced back at the butler, signaling him to leave the room. Then Luck turned back to Solaris, calling her big sister. Luck asked the girl if Celis could keep a secret. The girl said that she could, after which the young man took the card in his hands and said that he would reveal his true identity to her. The boy immediately removed the disguise from his adventurer card and handed it to Golan's daughter again. It said that the boy's name was Lack and that he was an S rank. The young man pointed his thumb at himself firmly and said that he was a magician named Lack. He then added that after this, Golan's daughter should understand everything. Tears began to form in the girl's eyes again. She looked at the young man opposite her for a long time, and then asked if he really was the great sage Lack. After Lake turned away, starting to gradually leave the living room, Solaris jumped up from her seat and screamed, "What does all this mean?" Lake started to turn to her, saying what he said. Lack explained that he had returned from the interdimensional rift 10 days ago. That is why he says that the story about Golan being his fellow adventurer is true. The girl was shocked by this, after which she began to slowly approach the window. Solaris said that this was all very unexpected for her. Luck turned around, not understanding what the girl was suggesting. When she approached the windowsill, she stared at the street, carefully holding her dress. The girl said that she had never even thought of such a thing before. Then she quietly added that it turned out that the great sage whom everyone called Lack was her younger brother. Lack smiled nervously, staring at the girl. Solaris suddenly got excited, quickly saying that if you think about it, Lack's hero status reminds her of her father in some way, and most likely it's because Lack is his son. Lack began to realize that the girl was getting more and more confusing, and he couldn't even stop her. The girl began to apologize to Luck, who by that time was already very tired of hammering the truth into the girl's head. He sprawled on a chair and threw his head up. Celis said she was terribly sorry. Luck said weakly that the girl had a very strong imagination. Golan's daughter said she was told that quite often. Suddenly, Lack said that he seemed to understand the reason why Golan was against the girl registering and becoming an adventurer. Celis continued to look at Lack guiltily. The young man thought that a strong imagination also presupposes a strong will. Luck suddenly said that he had a proposal for Celis, but with one condition. So they set out, dressed in the appropriate equipment for an adventurer. Celis stood opposite a large mountain, under which was a crystal-clear lake. The girl was amazed by such beauty. Lack asked Celis to do one of the simpler tasks for the guild. The girl had already registered as an adventurer, which was what Golan had feared. She also now had a personal card in the name of Celis Morton. Lack thought that if he hadn't gone with her, she would have taken on some task and gone on a journey alone. The girl really wanted to explore the world around her on her own. Golan had been too busy with the guild's affairs lately, because the situation was getting worse time after time, so his daughter was kind of locked up at home. Celis turned to Lack, asking the boy why he had joined the girl on her adventure. She thought that E-rank missions were too boring. Celis made the assumption herself, saying that she was the daughter of an old comrade, so Luck was worried about her. Luck said that was one of the reasons, but there was something else. The girl looked forward excitedly and said that she had not grown up on lullabies, but on many stories about her father's adventures. Dragons, the size of mountains, strange birds inside volcanoes, flying whales, and all that stuff. Celis finally recalls that these stories were much more interesting than any picture book, because in these stories her father was the main character. Lack thought that was the reason why the girl wanted to become a fighter like him in Golan. Celis said that it was because she wanted to be like her father, and besides, she had no talent for magic. The girl then lifted a large boulder off the ground, holding it with one hand, and said that being a fighter with thin feminine arms must sound terrible, but she was quite strong. Lack, seeing this, was a little confused, confirming Celis's words. Afterwards, the girl said that she wanted to be as strong as her father, to become a fighter who could protect everyone. Lack saw that the girl had quite mature views, so he went on to open up, saying that Golan would be quite difficult to surpass. The boy recalled that he was truly inhumanly strong. Celis folded her hands on her legs and said dejectedly that she knew it. The girl added that she probably wasn't as talented as her father, but therefore she would have to try harder. Lack, hearing this, thought seriously. The guy first turned his head to the girl and then looked ahead, repeating in his head the words about efforts. Afterwards, Lack said that she couldn't even imagine how many times Golan had been on the brink of death. The guy also added that, in fact, every adventurer who had set foot on Golan's path had lost his life before reaching her father's level. Luck began to remember the story, that for Golan, Eric, and him, their outstanding talents and dedication, as well as the fate that was placed upon them, were the reasons why they were able to survive. They would probably be long dead if they hadn't managed to roll a 6 every time. They kept getting into this kind of situation until today. In the end, there are no shortcuts. And the fastest way is to take on tasks that suit you and also help you become stronger. It was very important not to try to jump above your head. Afterwards, Lack looked at Celis with a smile on his face and said that this was the best way to become as great and strong as her father Golan. The girl looked at Lack with embarrassment, then smiled back and agreed. The guy suggested moving forward, after which he stood up and thought that his words were not true. Lack understood perfectly well that even when people take on suitable tasks for them, they still die during their execution. There is always a risk. The guild itself could be wrong in calculating the risks, as it had been with the goblins last time. If Ario and Genie had not been with him then, they would have definitely died. Locke continued to follow the girl and think about it. They gradually returned to the populated area, where the girl went to talk about her task. Lack thought that there was something he could do for Celis. The guy could give her knowledge and various techniques so that she would not lose her life in this difficult matter. After talking to the locals, Celis said that, judging by their words, people counted that there were as many rabid animals as indicated in the task, and there were no casualties among people. Cerberus, hydras, chimeras, cyclops, and even dragons were there, causing Celis to exclaim. Lack said that if that was true, then such a mission was not suitable for an E rank. Celis thought about it, saying that she was interested in what was happening now. The girl thought that there should be no magical creatures near the capital. Like just spread his arms slightly, saying that was why the guild decided that these beasts didn't really exist. Celis looked at the guy silently, not answering. The girl continued to think deeply at the instigation of Lack himself, who also asked Celis to cast aside all her prejudices and developed imagination. Celis soon came to the conclusion that the group of animals had been spotted, but apparently did not exist at all. The girl said that this was the reason they did not harm people. Celis, having put everything together, raised her hand and looked at Luck attentively. The girl said that only one thing came to her mind. All this was the magic of illusion. Luck smiled, turning to the girl, and then said that he had thought about it too. Then Celis said that they should hurry quickly in that case to where she was last seen. Quite suddenly, a huge fire-breathing dragon appeared in front of them, raising the wind with its landing and began to open its burning mouth. The girl looked at all this, telling Luck that this was obviously an illusion. The girl noticed that he felt himself getting hotter, which she also asked the magician about. The guy confirmed, saying that it was a very accurate illusion of an ancient dragon. But Lack did not feel any weight, so he asked not to fall for the visual deception. The girl's legs began to buckle from fear and shake. Lack took the girl by the shoulder, helping her gain confidence, and then told her to just go for it. Celis quickly looked at Lack and said that she would do it. Then, the girl rushed forward and ran straight towards the huge dragon in front of her. Once she was close enough, Celis pulled out her sword and dodged the tail strike before jumping on it. She ran closer to the monster's vulnerable part. As she climbed higher, she almost caught up with the dragon's head that she was about to strike down. Her gaze remained confident and focused on the dragon. The illusion tried to look around to find the little girl, but Celis seemed to have evaporated for him, remaining in the clouds of dust raised by the dragon. Suddenly, the illusion of the ancient dragon heard the girl's movement. Celis pushed off the ground as he ducked and began to approach his head, raising her sword. The dragon managed to raise its massive paw, blocking the sword strike. The girl hit the monster's strong claw, which only had a small crack on it. Celis decided to change the direction of the blow, but the dragon very skillfully fought back with his paw, not giving the girl much scope for her combat actions. Luck continued to watch closely as the girl continued to fight her battle. He was very interested in the tenacity and drive that Celis continued to demonstrate. Lack thought that Celis's skills as a fighter were incredible. Even without her bias against Golan, the girl's strength was on par with a B-rank adventurer. But, if we discard almost everything that was connected with Celis now, there remained the part that interested Luck much more, and this interest only grew stronger. The boy noticed that this ancient dragon was a monstrously realistic illusion. Magic. Lax thought that even he, an S-rank adventurer, was not capable of such a thing. When it comes to illusion magic, low-level mages can only create phantoms. But this thing is a giant accumulation of magical power. Thus, since Celis's sword had come into contact with the illusion, the boy was completely certain that she had sensed her reaction. It was truly astonishing. And there was something else. The more this illusion reacted, the more it seemed to have some kind of intelligence of its own. Suddenly, the dragon began to prepare a fiery breath. Celis looked at all this with tension. The dragon began to spew a huge stream of fire straight towards the girl. Celis only managed to shield herself from it with her sword. When the fire caught up with her, it surrounded the girl, but did no significant damage, only knocking Celis back. Lack thought this was the right moment. Lack rushed towards the dragon, flying up from his place. Afterwards, the magician used acceleration, which helped him reach the head of the ancient dragon in the same second. When Lack was already on the illusion's head, he put his hand on it, after which he closed his eyes for a moment. When his eyes opened again, the guy began to study this ability. So his pupils regained their normal shape, after which the boy smiled widely. Lack said that he would learn such illusion magic with great pleasure. Soon the study was completed. Immediately after that, Lasik rushed down, and then pointed his hand at the dragon, wanting to dispel the illusion. As Lack shouted the dispel spell, the dragon began to transform into a light spiral of magical energy, gradually beginning to shrink in size and disappear. Soon the magic began to be absorbed by Luck himself, slowly flowing into his hand. The boy noticed a flash in the distance, after which he said how much longer Celis would roll on the ground. Celis began to examine herself, after which she screamed in surprise that she didn't even have any burns. Luck languidly repeated that it was all because the dragon was just illusion magic. Luck turned to the girl and said that she would be doomed to defeat if she was going to fight illusion magic head-on. Celis began to whine, saying that Luck could have said that in the beginning. Celis sat on the ground, and Luck continued to say that with such illusion magic that could fool her, the girl could even kill herself if she believed that she was hurt. Luck also added that if you can't determine the location of the mage, then in such cases, it is best to retreat. The girl puffed out her cheeks and said that retreating was unpleasant, to which Lack replied that it was better than death. Lack walked out onto a small hill and then shouted at the illusionist who was listening in. The guy said he could come out and talk to them. In order not to inadvertently scare the illusionist, Lack decided to sheathe his weapon, showing that they were not going to fight the magician, causing him harm. Lack shouted again, saying that the boy knew that the mage had not harmed anyone in the village. The boy assumed that the mage simply wanted no one to come here. Lack and Celis continued walking forward, wandering deeper and deeper into the forest, noting along the way any possible traces that the illusionist might have left. Suddenly a voice was heard. This voice came from a place where there was a small old log, empty and hollow inside. The voice said that he had to protect something. Lack turned around, thinking it might be a child. The boy began to answer the voice, asking if what the mage was protecting was here and if he could take it to another place. Lack said that he understood everything. After that, the guy added that it looked like they would have to report that they had failed the guild mission. Personally, he didn't care, as he also said, but Celis immediately got angry. Celis began to look at the guy with pitiful eyes, saying that he was so suddenly ready to fail her first task. Lack said that the girl could not be demoted below F rank, so she should not worry. The girl didn't even understand what Luck was talking about. She started crying, imagining what she would say to her father. Then Luck turned to the illusionist, saying that they could continue the dialogue. Lack, looking ahead, confidently repeated that he didn't care if he failed a mission. He continued, saying that even if they failed, they would send another adventurer here. Afterwards, Lack said that the next adventurer might not be as accommodating as they were, and he could already force something to talk and even kill it. Luck continued, saying that if it all came to what the boy was saying now, it would be bad for everyone. Luck wanted to avoid that at all costs. Soon the voice agreed with Luck and said that he understood everything. From this magical whirlpool, a silhouette of a person in a dark hood began to emerge. It was not clear at first whether it was a guy or a girl, but the age was definitely quite young. At first, Celis thought it was just a boy who wielded magic. Then she saw a small horn sticking out from under his hood, and the girl immediately grabbed her sword, exclaiming that there was a demon in front of them. But Lack shielded the girl with his hand, showing that they were not going to use weapons. The boy immediately pulled his hood tighter to hide the signs of his race. Lack just smiled at the boy, saying that his illusion was just amazing magic. Also, the boy was able to completely hide his presence, which also caused respect. By this time, Celis had calmed down and let go of her weapon. The boy was a little scared, after which he became a little embarrassed, looked away and thanked Lack. Lack decided to introduce himself to start making contact. The boy said he was an F-rank adventurer who was just passing by. Pointing his finger at the girl, Lack also introduced Celis. The boy leaned down, removing his hood. He introduced himself as Lucilius, and immediately said that he was very pleased to meet him. Celis stared at the boy, staring at his horns. Celis leaned towards Luck and began to say that in her mind all demons were evil creatures. Luck said that was just a common misconception that many people held. Afterwards, Lack added that they have powerful magic and are very capable in combat. But this does not mean that they are hostile. However, this is indeed an unusual race, around which there are many rumors. Lack began to ask the boy what Lucilius wanted to protect. The demon responded by saying that he could show them, but the couple would have to follow him. The boy also said that they could keep their swords. Luck followed and asked the reason why the boy began to trust him. Lucilius said that his illusion magic did not work on him, so the boy realized that Luck was much stronger than him as a mage. After walking a few hundred meters, the boy stopped at an old building and turned to Luck and Celis. The boy pointed to a dark entrance and said that they were there. Lucilius continued to walk ahead. Inside, much had been destroyed, but it did not yet resemble ruins. Lack and Celis looked around intently. Lucilius took hold of a small wooden fence shaped like a door. Lack, looking at the walls, thought that this building was very ancient, and the bas-reliefs looked like Eastern runes. The boy entered the brighter and warmer room and knelt down, saying that he had returned. The boy was addressing someone named Gerberga. When Luck and Celis followed, their faces immediately changed in their emotions, for both were very surprised by what they saw here. The demon boy sat opposite a laying hen, which was nesting in a small and neat nest. Lucilius said that this was his secret, which he kept. Celis, Luck, and Lucilius stood in front of the bird, watching it in amazement. The girl leaned over and said that it was a sacred chicken, which immediately made Lucilius angry. The little demon began to say that the girl was an impudent scoundrel, since she dared to call the sacred herberg a chicken. Celis, however, said that no matter how you look at it, that's how it is. Although Lack tried to figure out who it was on his own at first, the guy still decided to ask Lucilius. The magician turned, asking what was so special about Gerbert. Lucilius quickly exhaled and said that Gerbert was a sacred rooster that had been imbued with divine powers. Such animals are very rare and incredibly valuable. There were some things that Celis flatly refused to accept, like the story with her brother. The girl stood behind Luck and looking at Lucilius said again that she only saw a chicken here. From all this, Lucilius gradually began to lose his temper. Luck, seeing this, shut Celis's mouth with his palm, after which he asked the boy how the divine power manifests itself. The legend says that Gerbert's ancestors woke up this world with their crow. The sacred rooster is the god that the boy's tribe worships, which is why he guarded it so carefully. The Lucilia tribe lived in the mountains far to the north, but that was until the day a group of vampires suddenly attacked the village. No one could have predicted this, so there were inevitable consequences for the village. Of the entire village, only the boy managed to survive. The rest were killed that day, leaving no one alive in their path. Lack and Celis froze from such a sad story. Lucilius also said that the chief of the tribe entrusted him with Gerberg, as the youngest in the entire tribe, and told him to escape. The boy used illusion magic to escape. The vampires are still chasing him. Lack looked at the boy and said that vampires are quite smart, and that is why they can cause a lot of trouble. Lucilius, looking down, agreed with this statement. Lack looked around, saying that the boy had come here because this place had its own power that had helped him. The boy said that it was so, because this place was marked on the map that had been passed down from generation to generation in his tribe. Lack tried to study the place, but could not find anything that stood out from the magical powers. When he asked why the boy chose these ruins, Lucilius said that they were part of an ancient temple that had a barrier that repelled vampires. Lack thought that after the boy came here, the pursuers did not try to attack him anymore. Lucilius said that at first they were attacked several times, but then the attack stopped. Lack started thinking again when Lucilius said that he was left alone later. He realized that it was most likely because Shia had managed to deal with some of the vampires here. Lack carefully examined the half-ruined temple and told the boy his version of why the attacks on it had stopped. Lucilius could not believe that the barrier had not been there all this time. Lack confirmed that there had recently been a battle between vampire hunters and vampires nearby. That was the reason they hadn't had the strength to attack the boy. Lucilius immediately began to panic and rush around the room, asking where he could hide then. Gerber jumped up from his nest to begin running after the boy. Lack said that the vampires and their boss were destroyed, so they will not come for him anymore. Lucilius sadly said that other vampires could still come for Gerberg. Lack crossed his arms over his chest and asked the boy the reason why the vampire army was chasing them. Lucilius took a bit of a breath before saying it was because of Gerberg. Lack guessed that this was somehow directly related to the power that awakens the world that the demon had mentioned earlier. Lucilius confirmed this, then said that this power was capable of creating boundaries in this world. The thing is that when the world woke up, a line between day and night immediately appeared in it. Gerberg has a direct relation to this, and is the keeper of the Force. It is Gerberg's voice that is endowed with the power and strength to distinguish our world and its boundaries. In addition, the sacred rooster can intercept any movements between worlds. Lack folded his arms and said that from everything Lucilius had just said, Gerberg could close the passage to the interdimensional rift. Lucilius nodded his head and said that was true. Now, Locke had a clear picture and idea. He understood everything because it meant that the vampires began to despair and began to look for different options. Their plan was to use the power of the cursed medallions to open an interdimensional rift and then summon gods from another dimension. But their whole plan could simply go down the drain due to the clucking of one sacred rooster that lived in a small tribe of demons. Locke turned to the boy and extended his hand, telling him that Lucilius should come with them. Now Luck and Celis were going to head to the capital with Gerberg. The boy at first didn't even understand what Lack was talking about. Lucilius began to question the magician in surprise, continuing to hold the rooster. Lack took out his sword and stuck it into the ground. Lack extended his hand forward, after which the sword began to rise from the ground and hover in the air. The guy firmly said that this was the sword of the demon lord. Lucilius, full of amazement, continued to stare silently at what would happen next. Lack, however, said that there was only one reason why this weapon was here now. There was a brief silence. Everyone was excited, and then Lack finally said that it was all because he was able to defeat the demon lord in the other world. While Lucilius froze and stood, casting surprised glances first at Lack, then at Celis. The girl stood behind the magician and tried to add more solemnity with her gestures. Lucilius said that this could not be. The boy began to tremble slightly, after which he asked if the great sage Luck really stood before him. Lucilius exclaimed, trying to find out how Luck had managed to survive. The young man smiled and said that he didn't really like the nickname they called him, but it was really him. Afterwards, Lack began to drop to one knee, putting away his sword, and said that it was for this very reason that the young man wanted Lucilius to trust him. Lack, placing his hand on his chest, added that he swears on his name that he will defend Gerber with his life if it requires it, while Lucilius remained silent. Still aware of what was happening, Luck continued, saying that Gerberg had the power to save their world. The mage also added that Lucilius had done a good job of protecting him. Luck proudly said that on behalf of everyone living in this world, the boy wanted to express his gratitude to the entire Lucilia tribe. The boy held Gerberg and said thank you to Luck. After that, he tried to say something else, but emotions began to take over. Lucilius began to shed tears, continuing to try to say something. He was still very young, so such decisions were quite difficult. The boy said that for the good of his tribe, he had to protect Gerberg. Lucilius understood that this was being done for everyone. Gerberg, whom everyone had protected until now, would save this world from the scourge of the dark gods from another world. The boy, continuing to cry, also said that the great sage and hero Lack was thanking him now, which additionally gave him a great burden of responsibility and emotions. With all this, the boy said that he had never felt such pride. Luck began to calm Lucilius, stroking his head with his hand. All three gradually began to move away, leaving the half-ruined sacred temple. Lucilius agreed to trust Lacus, so he also went with everyone, holding Gerberg. Celis put her finger to her chin and began to think out loud that Luck was just a freeloader who lived with them. The girl didn't even know if her dad would let them live with a pet. Lucilius shouted loudly that Gerber was neither a pet nor a chicken, and the boy was already tired of talking about it. Celis repeated that the deity really did look like that from the outside. Most likely, this noise began to attract those who could still follow Lucilius, who was hiding in the sacred temple. A vampire jumped out at them, and Luck managed to grab him by the throat, preventing him from breaking through. Celis immediately took out her blade. Lack, who was holding the monster tightly by the throat, suddenly lifted him up and asked him to the floor, hitting the vampire's head on the ground. He coughed a little, and, having pulled out several broken teeth, the vampire tried to back away. Soon Lack saw a winged one on the ground, after which there were already several vampires. Lucilius turned around, thinking it was not too late to run back to the temple where the barrier was. Celis began to shield the boy, holding her sword in front of her. There were 3 vampires in front of them now who could pose a serious threat. The one who had been dealt a blow by Luck immediately asked who the young man was. Luck said that he saw no reason to tell his name to a lesser vampire. After this, the monsters seemed to break loose from their chains, rushing at them and cursing. The vampires transformed slightly, changing their form. Celis immediately exclaimed that it was a power-up. She turned to Luck in panic, still standing behind him. The girl said that they did not look like the lower ones. Lack narrowed his eyes and calmly explained that he had said that on purpose, to let them show themselves. Lack understood that now they had definitely come for Lucilius, and their target was definitely the sacred cockerel. A large magic seal began to appear above the vampires, after which Locke thought that he would not let these monsters escape. The boy snapped his fingers, telling the vampires to try it. Magic arrows from Locke began to fall on the vampires from above. They only had time to turn around before they began to be pierced through, causing serious damage. But the vampires were much stronger, so they did not die. However, the arrows now prevented them from moving, as if they had pinned the monsters to the ground. This was exactly the plan that Lack had, and after that, he prepared the next spell. The next thing Luck wanted to do was to catch and imprison the vampires. To do this, the guy used a fiery prison, which immediately engulfed 3 monsters. Lack shouted to the vampires that they definitely couldn't escape. After the fire trap, the monsters were still alive, and were about to escape by turning into bats. At the same moment, when the vampires began to flee, the sacred rooster Gerbird began to crow and glow, continuing to be in Lucilius's hands. The vampires gradually continued to fly away, but as soon as they heard the sound of the rooster, they immediately turned their gaze in his direction. Their bodies began to crumble, turning into dust. One of the vampires managed to say that this sacred cockerel was not going to let them go from the very beginning. Celis exclaimed, not understanding what had just happened. The girl said that she saw all the vampires die when this chicken crowed. Lucilius, with his tired and angry look, continued to say that it was Gerberg. Lack also looked at the boy in surprise and said that Lucilius had spoken of another power of the rooster. The boy had said that Gerbert was separating worlds, but Lucilius had smiled and said that this was the reason why the vampire's transformation had been interrupted. Lucilius explained that transformation should not exist according to the power of the holy cockerel. It was because of this that all vampires began to turn to dust. Celis asked in surprise if the boy really had to hide from vampires. Name such a power. Lucilius said that she was only able to defeat vampires at the moment of transformation. Celis said it was still very surprising. It was a great trick if the vampires wanted to escape. Lucilius exclaimed, saying that Gerberg was truly a treasure. Soon the boys were already in the city. It had long since gotten dark outside and the stars had appeared. Lucilius was wary of the crowd of people, walking forward and constantly checking whether his hood was pulled tight. Lack smiled, gently placing his hand on the boy's head. The mage stroked the boy, telling Lucilius not to worry, since there was nothing threatening him here. Quite unexpectedly, right on his way home, Lack saw a girl he knew standing at the gate. It was Shia, but it was completely unclear why she was here so late. Shia rushed towards the boys, shouting that she was waiting for Lack. The mage asked the girl if she had returned from her village yet, then added that they had not seen each other for only a day. Celis glanced over her shoulder in disbelief. Shia said that she really had returned and had sorted everything out on her own. Pulling Lack aside, the girl said that she urgently needed to tell him something. Lack thought for a moment, realizing that they were now engaged in a very serious matter on which the future fate of the world depended. The guy firmly said that they would talk inside. The girl immediately leaned over to the other two guys who were with Lack and said that she was a vampire hunter and also a B-rank adventurer, Shia. Shia also added that she was glad to meet him, after which she immediately smiled. Lack added that this girl had once helped him enslave the vampire lord. Celis decided that all the attention was going to be taken away from her now, so it was time to do something. The girl stepped forward and proudly said that she was Luck's student. Shia was surprised by this fact because she thought that Lack did not teach anyone. Lack himself intervened, saying that this was indeed not the case. In his head, he understood that the atmosphere was becoming somewhat tense. But Luck didn't dwell on that. The boy invited Shia to follow him to his room to talk. When Celis also approached the door, the boy stopped her, then closed the door. Shia said that it was, and her home was only a 3-hour walk away. The girl folded her hands and said that she had to apologize for the urgency. The girl said that she could only trust him to tell her this thing. Lack pressed his hand to his chest, demonstratively pointing at himself, and said that he was ready to listen. Shia couldn't start for a long time, after which, seeing the guy's confidence, she noticed that she hadn't even said anything yet. Lack said that she needed his help, so she could tell everything as it was. Shia blushed a little before smiling and thinking that Luck was an incredibly sweet young man that she simply admired. Then she began, saying that the situation now is as follows. The vampires are planning something very big and grandiose. This even forced them to gather in large flocks. There was also some organization to all of this, because according to Shia, the person in charge of this whole thing is none other than the High Lord of the Vampires. This is what adds seriousness and danger. Lack turned away and took a few steps to the side, repeating Shia's last words about the High Lord of Vampires. Afterwards, the young man said that everything was only getting more complicated with each passing day. Lack knew very well that the High Lord of Vampires was the ruler of rulers who ruled the vampire lords. He was a monster who possessed power far greater than even a Mage. Shia added, saying that her Lycan tribe had made great efforts to uncover and thwart the vampire schemes, but they had difficulty even approaching the High Lord. The girl waited a little while for her hand to be closer to her body, after which she said with a sad voice that her father had not yet fully recovered, and it was quite difficult to admit some things. For example, when meeting with the tribal leaders, one should only go through brute force, because there is no other logical option. From this point of view, Shia thought that the vampires could completely destroy them. Lack smiled, throwing his leg up on the bed, and said that was the reason Shia wanted him to help. The girl said that it was, then added that she needed to find something before the High Lord did. Shia said with certainty that this fucking vampire was frantically searching for a certain chicken. The girl said that they had to protect her until he met the vampires. Seeing how Lack was thinking, the girl immediately straightened her arms and said that he might now think something like that. After what Shia said, for example, why protect a chicken? Lack started to try to say something, but Shia immediately interrupted him. The girl added that according to rumors, this chicken can close interdimensional and also prevent vampires from reincarnating. Luck knew perfectly well that Shia was talking about Gerberg. He said that he believed Shia and then began to say that he knew something. Shia began to laugh, saying that there was no need to support her, because she herself did not believe in it. The girl continued to be embarrassed, shaking her head, constantly adding that no matter how you look at it, it's just a chicken. Lack insisted that he believed her, but Shia thought that he was supporting her like that. Lack tried to get through to Shia and at some point firmly and seriously said that he had already met this very chicken that they were talking about now. Turning their attention for a second, the boys in Lack's room heard something rustling behind the door. Lack carefully got up from his seat and crept up to the door, motioning for Shia to be quiet. Then Luck jerked the door open. They immediately heard a scream coming from a child's voice. It was Celis, who was standing and eavesdropping. The girl squeezed out a few tears from the painful and sudden fall. Lucilius stood nearby and said that he had warned the girl not to eavesdrop on the conversation. Celis jumped up from her seat, immediately saying that it was all a misunderstanding. The girl said that Luck was wrong, and she did not do it. Luck asked where he was wrong, destroying Celis's subsequent arguments. Afterwards, the girl bowed her head, kneeling, and said she couldn't come up with a good excuse. Celis publicly apologized to Lack. Lack turned away, saying that he also had to apologize to Shia. The girl started to shed tears. "I apologize." Shia spread her hands, saying that everything was fine if Celis didn't tell everyone. Then Luck turned to the boy with the hood on his head and told Lucilius to come into the room too. Then the boy introduced Lucilius, the little demon. Pointing further to the bird in the boy's hands, Lack said that this was precisely the divine rooster that the girl and her tribe, the Gerberg, were looking for. Shia was truly surprised. After a short pause, Shia exclaimed that they had already found it. The girl also added that they expected nothing less from Lack. Lack scratched his head and said that it would be more accurate to say that he did it. However, it all came together after Celis joined the guild and took her first quest. They began investigating and gradually found Gerberg. Luck said that he had already seen with his own eyes how Gerberg used his power. The vampires immediately turned to dust. Shia exclaimed, saying that the legends were true. The girl looked at the sacred animal, then knelt down, saying that it was a great honor for her to meet the divine rooster. The rooster cackled happily. Lack turned to Shia, saying that since they already had the divine rooster, their next target was the High Lord of Vampires himself. Lack asked the girl if she knew where the High Lord might be now. The girl said that in their village they only knew the approximate location. Lack scratched his head, after which everyone in the room heard the door open downstairs, and then someone started to come in. Celis heard a servant follow and said that it was Papa. Gnad began to take off his outer garment, looking around. Then he asked the servant if there were any guests in his house, as if he sensed it. Lack left the room and rushed forward, starting down the stairs. The guy said that now was the time, so he would go and talk to Golan. The girl shouted after him, not believing that the boy was talking about the guildmaster. She was very nervous, but she waited upstairs. When Golan saw Lack, he smiled widely, saying that the boy came home today quietly. Golan was in a good mood. He immediately hugged the boy, saying that Lack had probably saved Celis this time. Golan hugged Lack, saying what the servants had told him, and then thanked his brother. Lack calmly said that although Golan called it help, they had only just completed the task. Golan chuckled, saying that if they matched the strength of Celis and Lack, the boy had grown noticeably. Lack smiled and said that he considered Celis a professional warrior. Indeed, despite her age, the girl already knows a lot. Golan said that the guy was really praising him. While Golan and Luck were talking, Celis suddenly appeared from the doorway of the room. The girl stood silently for a while and then finally called out to her father. Golan greeted his daughter joyfully, beckoning her to come over. The man solemnly said that he congratulated his daughter on completing her first guild quest. The first thing the girl said was to apologize to her father. After this, tears began to form in her eyes, which greatly shocked Golan. The girl began to repent, saying that she had treated her father too often and rather coldly before. She admitted that she had done such terrible things. Golan, like almost any man would do when he saw a woman cry, tried to calm his daughter down, turning over the appropriate words in his head. Lack continued to watch everything from the sidelines without interfering. Lack smiled shyly, thinking that it seemed that Golan, whom he had known for so many years, really did have a soft side that came out when he was around his daughter. When Celis calmed down a little and began to come to her senses, Golan finally asked her what his daughter was so angry about. He thought that it might be because he had become an adventurer and stood up to his daughter in this. The girl slowly began to say that she had mistakenly believed that her father had an illegitimate child. This was the reason for her latest tantrums at home. Golan continued listening, saying that this was complete nonsense. The man began to take the drink that the servant had brought him and said that such a thing could not possibly have happened to him. The girl happily folded her hands in front of her face and said that she knew it. Celis should have believed her father, but in her stupidity and haste she had jumped to conclusions. She gently pushed Golan and with a sly smile on her face said that she had already begun to think that Lake was her younger brother, whom their father had hidden from them. Golan, as soon as he heard this, even spat out his drink. The man grabbed his head and asked Celis, saying that he could be wrong, but he hoped that she was not bothering Laku with this. The girl immediately fell silent, turning away. Goldgwyn immediately saw her cheeks turn slightly red, after which he began to get angry, saying that he knew Celis had done it. The girl immediately exclaimed, raising her hand and saying that she would go and tell everyone else. Golden looked after her with a gloomy expression, and Lack understood how easily the daughter managed to escape from her father. Golan didn't turn to Lack, who was standing behind him for a while, because his father was ashamed. Lack said that he didn't care much about it, but apparently the girl often said unnecessary things. Gon apologized, then fell to his knees and began to bow to Lack. The man said that she was his daughter, and he did not expect that she would upset him so much with her behavior. Lack opened his eyes wide, began to look as if into Golan, which began to take him back in time. Lack remembered that they were once younger. Golan was always acting weird back then. He loved to go into a tavern or chase a goat, thinking it was a new kind of monster. There was even a time when he grabbed a waiter, thinking he was a robber. Golan turned to see the boy staring at him. He looked questioningly at Lack, who was thinking that Golan was giving off a fatherly aura. Then Golan said that, on the other hand, she could have been deceived by some evil man. He immediately began to rush about, saying that he had to dissuade his daughter from seeking adventure. Lack pulled his hand back a little and said it was okay. He was looking after her, as they had agreed. The friend assured Golan that he would stop the girl if she became reckless. Golan, with a tearful fatherly face, pressed himself against Luck, grabbing his hands. The man began to thank his friend for such care and service that he was providing. As Golan was thanking Luck, the door to their room suddenly opened. Celis strode forward confidently, shouting that she had told everyone everything and had brought them here. And for some reason, it was precisely with Holland's daughter that similar situations always happened, where she appeared at the wrong moment. He saw Golan and Lack hugging. The girl started screaming. Lack immediately went after her, asking Celis to wait. Lack added that he was sorry to disturb their family. The girl said that she would not tell anyone anything else. Exactly an hour had passed since Golan and Lack sat down to explain everything to the guildmaster's daughter. Lucilius and Shia watched from the side, and the guys soon sighed that the misunderstandings had disappeared. Lack, gradually moving away but still rolling his eyes like Golan, told his friend that they needed to get back to the main topic. Golan agreed, saying that the vampires were gathering somewhere. Lack said that's exactly it. Based on what Shia from the Vampire Hunter Village said, it can be assumed that all the collections are currently being secretly managed by the High Lord. Golan exclaimed when he heard the mention of the High Lord. The man folded his hands together, then slowly said that this could not be called a simple nuisance. Luck stood up from his chair and said that either way, they were leaving Gerberg as an ace in the hole, while also hitting the headquarters with a vampire and a High Lord. Someone in the company suggested that Gerberg was very strong, so perhaps he could help them. Lack said that it would be more difficult to fight and at the same time protect the sacred rooster. Shia stood up and said that she had completely forgotten to mention one thing. If the High Lord drank the blood of the divine rooster, then a curse would immediately fall and the interdimensional gates would open. The news that Shia brought was truly terrible. Lucilius hugged the bird tighter and began to ask loudly if it was true. Shia began to explain that the curse was born from the desecration of life. More importantly, the most sacred, desecrated object could create the most powerful curse. Apparently, Lucilius and Gerberg knew nothing about this. Shia added that when it comes to collecting curses, killing people is dirtier than killing mice, and killing gods is the worst of all. Lack thought that if that was indeed the case, they had less and less reason to move forward. He also thought that they could put up a barrier around the estate to upgrade the defenses. Golan said that it was certainly possible to do so, but they could do it a little differently, entrusting the divine being to Eric. Lolan said in surprise that Golan was now talking about the royal palace. Golan said that was true. The man added that if it really was a divine chicken, then entrusting its protection to the royal family would be entirely permissible. Celis smiled and told her father that it was a great idea. Golan said that the royal palace would definitely be safe, so they would quickly send a messenger there. Some time passed. That evening, the group gathered some things and went to the palace of the capital. Shia and Lucilius were surprised by how big the castle itself was. The royal courtier escorted the guests, and then opened the doors leading to a large and spacious room. The man said that they could pass, pointing with his hand. Lack noticed that the chamberlain who had escorted them here was quite young, even too young. Golan smiled and said that he was a student and that they were raising a lot of them here. Lack was surprised, and the guildmaster began to say that in the royal capital there is now a certain trend for all this. There are knights' apprentices, chamberlains' apprentices, cooks' apprentices, and so on. In total, there are about 2,000 apprentices in different professions. Lack thought it was too much. Golan said that this was the welfare policy. The second and third sons of impoverished nobles, the sons of knights who lost in battle, they all study and find work faster. Lack, seeing how Shia and Lucilius were clutching the magnificent, judging by their faces, said that Eric seemed to be a great king, and besides, his motto is, "Education enriches the country." The man walked into the room, leading the little girl in front of him, who was a little shy, as you could see. He immediately turned to Luck, saying that he had heard about his victory over the vampire lord. He also added that Luck seemed to be meeting his daughters for the first time. The girls smiled and introduced themselves. One was Charlotte, the older one, and the younger one was Maria. Locke said that the girls were very polite, and he was glad to meet them. Eric said that this guy was a friend of his father, and then he said his name. The girls rejoiced, saying that Locke was a real hero. Charlotte said that it was a great honor for them to meet them personally. The eldest daughter also called Lack His Excellency Archduke Franzen. At this time, Maria was holding a book written based on the legends about Lack. Eric leaned over and pointed out that little Maria liked the heroic stories about Locke, so the boy shouldn't forget to sign this picture book. Lack was surprised to see a picture book in the girl's hands. Shia turned around and said that all the children in this country grow up with stories about Lack, because he is the hero that every child wants to be. Luck thought it was all just brainwashing. Meanwhile, Lucilius, who was holding the rooster, said that even Gerber liked a book about Luck. Golan turned to his daughter and asked her to go play with their highnesses, Princess Charlotte and Princess Mary. The girls called Celis Big Sister and ran to the nursery. Lack noted that the girls became friends right away. Golan said that Celis always wanted a little sister, so she often came to play in the royal palace. Eric apologized, realizing that the matter was urgent, but the man added that his daughters wanted to see their hero Lack no matter what. Eric said that because Lack had personally dispersed Majine's army 10 years ago, the future king was awarded 2 flowers of life. Now his happiness lies in Charlotte and Maria. But the point is that this opportunity was given to him by Luck, and not only to him, for all the inhabitants of the country and the continent thank him. They all want to convey these feelings to him at any cost. The hero said that a picture book is too much. It was already late afternoon, and everyone had settled down to discuss the main topic. The maids had prepared a light supper and tea, and Lack was telling the king about the recent vampire activity. This means that the recent activity of the vampires was planned by them. Lack said that one way or another, the blood of the divine rooster would cause the curse to accumulate immediately. So the deity must be protected at all costs. Golan asked Lack what strategy he wanted to use to fight the High Lord. The boy said that at the moment he thought the best solution would be to join Shia and the beastman hunters. Eric and Golan initially nodded their heads in approval, but after Lack said that he was going to attack them after the unification, the heroes became indignant. Golan was amazed that this was all the strategy that Luck could come up with. It seemed more like suicide or complete nonsense, because vampires are very strong. Lack began to calm his comrade, stretching out his hands in front of him. The young man asked Golan to just think for a moment, after which he began to describe his idea in more detail. Lack said he would be in the vanguard and begin to draw away the hordes of lords that would surely come at him. That's when a gap would form and a group of beastmen would strike at the High Lord. Golan thought about it seriously, then said that he would have done it differently anyway. At the very least, the guildmaster had suggested that the roles should have opposite tasks. Afterwards, the guy looked at Shia and said in a drawn-out voice that yes, indeed, the highest lord is much stronger than the other lords. Afterwards, Locke said that it would be much more painful to go up against a bunch of lords. Shia said that this was all true, of course, but even if they couldn't defeat them, they were able to block the lord's path. Then she added that in the lands of the vampires, Locke was the only one who could kill him. So he thought about it, but did not answer right away. Golan explained that there was a possibility that the clash would result in many casualties on the beastman's side. The man asked if Shia was sure. Shia gritted her teeth, showing her small fangs, and immediately said that she was sure with all her heart. The girl believed that this was 100 times better than letting the High Lord escape. Lucilius and Luck were sitting on a small sofa together. Suddenly, Golan turned to his comrade again, apologizing. Golan said that he wanted to request reinforcements from the guild, but the vampires were enchanting. Afterwards, Golan said that he did not know if the beastman tribe was capable of resisting the powers of the vampires, but he could not stand by and watch as his friends were killed, one by one. However, the girl added that they would be able to distinguish them from beastmen. On the other hand, despite the fact that enchanted people are endowed with the same abilities, at this time, someone was holding a thick rope. It was a girl who worked as a servant in the castle. Most likely, she'd already been charmed, so she tied the door handles with a thick rope and began to walk away. Charlotte, Eric's daughter, tried to open the door of the room with Maria, but she couldn't. The girl told her older sister Celis about it. Celis confidently told Charlotte, Maria, and Gerberga to stand behind her and be extremely careful. Taking the candlestick, the girl directed her gaze at the emerging black magic. They were undead in long black robes with white headdresses, which are usually worn in a monastery. Their faces and hands were too thin, which made them even more terrifying. Celis looked at them and immediately became nervous. She thought to herself that it was Lychee, which she couldn't believe. To think that they were attacking children inside the royal palace. Lich Kings. These are wizards or priests of the highest rank who, after death, were forcibly transformed into undead for all time. They are the kings of immortality, highly intelligent and capable of using magic. The room was getting cooler, and the smell of corpses was beginning to permeate. The liches began to prepare themselves, wrapping themselves in magical signs. Celis regretted not having brought her sword. The girl thought about whether she could overcome them or not. Soon she began to encourage herself, saying that, in this situation, she, as a real hero, must do everything possible. The girl drew a line on the floor in the shape of a circle with a sharp candlestick. Celis thought that it would give her confidence, and she did not want her enemies to take even a step for her. Celis lifted the candlestick a little, holding it like a sword, and thought again that the enemies would not pass. She would stand and protect the divine rooster and the princesses until the very end. The liches did not rush to attack their opponent, who was armed with a melee weapon. The undead began to attack the girls with magic. Celis began to remember everything she could learn and hear. She placed her hand on her weapon, thinking that if she could channel the magic power through the weapon, she could reflect the spell back. Celis grew up hearing stories of adventure and bravery from her father. She was mentored by Luck himself, so Celis decided she would prove to them that she could do it on her own. Celis began to spin the candlestick, catching the first magical blow. Quickly changing the position of her weapon, she then parried the second and third attacks. It so happened that the girl reflected one of the magic balls into the wall of the room, which immediately exploded and began to crumble down. The guards on the street immediately exploded, starting to look up. The undead, realizing that they would not be able to directly break through Celis's defense, decided to act differently. One of the liches raised his hands, after which a rune appeared from above, from which magical arrows emerged. The arrows shot towards the girls and began to shatter against the barrier, missing their target. The liches tried to understand the reason through the fragments. It was Luck who hugged Celis and put up a defense. Celis began to slowly open her eyes, initially thinking that she was finished. Then she saw Luck's face, who was smiling, and then calmly said that the girl had done a good job, but he had expected nothing less from her. Still, Luck called the girl his student. All the children in the room were terrified. Luck stood firm on his feet, saying that now it was time for her teacher to sort this out. Thus, the main problems become the vampire's ability to charm and manipulate, which leads to you being attacked by people who were recently your comrades. Golan continued, saying that it would not be difficult for him or Eric as they had high resistance to mental disorders, but they could not recruit regular soldiers. The beastman seriously and apologized to Shia. The girl started waving her hand, saying that the vampire's charms didn't work on beastmen either, so she wanted them to be allowed to fight. Lack suddenly felt something, after which he jumped up from his seat. The guy immediately rushed to the door. The others were surprised, glaring at the guy, to which Lack said that the enemy was in the palace. Lack could sense the evil energy hanging somewhere in the area of the room with the little girls. The magician shouted that he would take a shortcut, destroying the window with arrows. As soon as Lack jumped out, he immediately used his levitation abilities to avoid falling down. Afterwards, he immediately saw a threat in the form of the three Lich Kings. Lack arrived just in time, stopping and destroying all the magic arrows that were flying towards Celis. The girl's mouth fell open in amazement, unable to say anything. The Liches gradually began to increase their pressure. They used more and more spells, which were stronger than the previous ones, but they still could not break through Lack's protective barrier. Lack just smirked at us undead sages, saying that they were too slow. He began to drive the sphere towards them, into which he intended to drive the Liches, and then lock them there. After Luck started getting his plan right, the guy started taking further action. Now the pressure, temperature, and density inside the sphere will increase at a hellishly fast rate. All the boy wished for the undead army was to burn to ashes. Holding his hand out in front of him, Lack quickly closed it into a fist and shouted implosion. The sphere began to shrink very quickly to an incredibly small size, until it was just a black dot. Celis stood behind, clasping her hands and admiring her teacher. The girl understood that these three Liches had turned into nothing but pieces of ash in the blink of an eye. Now Celis understood what the legendary great sage Lack Franzen really was. The girl looked ahead, trying to see something through the rising smoke. She asked what it all meant, and wondered where the Liches had gone. Two magicians appeared in the room quite unexpectedly. Lack and the girls managed to hide. The men discussed the Liches they had sent ahead, and then thought they had disobeyed. Afterwards, they began to discuss the target, which had apparently escaped. One of the company said that one could not rely on other people's rotting brains. Lack realized that these were the ringleaders, lesser vampires, most likely. Luck decided that this was the perfect moment. He began his transformation using the illusion magic he had borrowed from Lucilius earlier. The boy turned into a tall, white-haired man. He stood before two vampires and called out to them. They quickly turned around and began to exclaim that this couldn't be happening. Now, as they thought, there was an eighth one standing before them. Lack, in the form of a vampire lord, began to ask the lower ones what they were doing here. The guy began to intimidate them, saying that they were standing in his way. The vampires said that they were here on the orders of the sixth. Lack thought that even though only lesser vampires could pass through the castle's barrier, it seemed he had managed to get these two through. If the lords were ranked numerically, then the sixth one was the senior. Lack asked the vampires the purpose of their coming here, and what their orders were. The lower vampires replied that they had come here to capture the divine chicken. Lack said he hadn't heard anything about it. The boy added that right now, at this very moment, the two were on their way to fulfilling an important mission that had been entrusted to them by the High Lord himself. The two vampires were very surprised to hear this. Lack confirmed his words, saying that the High Lord had also directly ordered their sixth one as well. The servants of the sixth lord said that according to their information, many people serve the sixth, and among them, there are even those who were able to infiltrate the royal palace and gain a foothold here. Celis understood everything very quickly, thinking immediately about Rowana. Lack said that now he understood everything, adding that there could be misunderstandings. The lower vampires apologized to him. Lack turned his head and saw the bowl, over which the magic circle was still held. The mage immediately thought that the lower vampires had brought it here with them. Afterwards, Luck said that it would be much better if he himself spoke with the sixth in person. He also asked if he could reach the sixth with the help of this magic circle. Just as the lower vampires began to say that with the help of the circle, Luck would indeed be able to find the Lord. The door to the room was kicked down with one powerful blow. The lower vampires immediately turned their gaze to the man who had broken through into the room. It was Golan, who immediately shouted the name of his friend Lack as he continued to break through. Lack knew he couldn't get anything more out of these two, even though he seemed to have learned enough. The guy reached for his sword, which he began to carefully draw in front of him. Lack began to take out his blade, continuing to look into the eyes of the two lower vampires, frozen to the floor with fear. The guy said sharply that now they would end. The vampires didn't even have time to move a centimeter. Lack's blade was already flying towards one of them, after which it cut the monster into two halves. After that, with the same lightning-fast and quick movement, Lack finished with the second one. He began to return to his original form. The vampires quickly turned into piles of ash. Eric followed Golan in. His two daughters, the little princesses Charlotte and Maria, saw their father and immediately ran to him. wiping away fresh tears as they went. Golan stamped his foot loudly, attracting the attention of everyone present, and then asked how they managed to get into the palace, since it was protected by magic. Lack began to explain that it was absolutely impossible to bring a magic circle. However, it was possible to bring a completed teleportation magic circle here. Lack immediately pointed to the bowl, then turned to Celis. The boy asked the girl if there was a silver tray there. The Golan's daughter replied that Rowan's maid had brought it along with the sweets. Lack added that this magical item disguised as a silver tray allows the use of teleportation magic. The guy said that we need to grab the maid right now. As soon as Lack finished, Shia immediately jumped up and ran to the exit of the room. The maid shouted her name, but the girl immediately answered that she was the only one who knew Rowana by face. Shia, who understood everything without further ado, looked at Lack and nodded. The girl said that she would go with her, since Celis could be charmed or subdued. After this, Lack turned to Golan and told his friend to take care of Gerber's defense. The castle, in his opinion, must be full of the Lord's petty descendants. Golan turned to Lack and asked what he would do now. The young man rushed towards the cup, saying that he was going to kill their boss, whom the vampires called the Sixth. Having slightly picked up and crumpled his cloak under himself, Lack took 2 wide steps, after which he jumped straight onto the bowl, which continued to glow because of the magic circle. Lack looked around. The seal was above his head, and around him were the walls of either a dark castle or a dungeon. It was very dark, and there was a very thick fog flying around. Lack heard someone approaching him, looking at him with wide eyes. Soon a hand reached out to the boy, which he quickly intercepted. The boy had enough time to cast the illusion again and turn into the Eighth again. He held tightly to the hand of one of the lesser vampires, then told him to step aside. The servant became even paler than vampires usually are. He pointed his hand at Luck in the illusion, and exclaimed that he was the 8th one. The lesser vampire leaned over, whispering that the 8th was rumored to have died in battle with the beastman. He also said that he was glad to see the Lord. Lack pressed the servants, saying that the Lord could not have fallen like a serf. The servant began to apologize, asking for humility. Lack agreed, after which he was immediately asked the question, like, for what reason did the 8th teleport here? Lack said he met several servants when he infiltrated the royal palace on a secret mission. He added that he received a message from the High Lord and asked if the 6th was there. The servant replied that the 6th was indeed here now, after which he turned his back on the 8th and asked him to follow him. Lack was pleased that everything had worked out. Lack and the servant walked for quite a long time along the dark corridors, where torches were periodically placed, illuminating small pieces of space. Lack looked around and then asked the servant if this place was new. The lower vampire answered that it was. He explained that the fortress was built on the orders of the 6th, which he gave to the peasants. At first, Lack did not understand which peasants were being talked about, but the servant immediately explained to him that the 6th had recently attacked the nearest village and subjugated the surviving peasants. After all, he continued, the subordinates were a fine workforce. He also said that those who did not join were made their food. The lesser vampire made a disgusting sound with his tongue, which made Locke feel a little uneasy. Continuing to walk behind the servants, Luck said in his own voice that it was time to stop this. The vampire began to turn around in surprise, after which the young man said that he did not need to be shown the way any further. The vampire began to turn slowly, realizing that someone else was following him. But as soon as he turned completely towards Lack, the guy cut him down with a sword. The lower vampire died instantly, leaving behind only dust into which all other monsters of a similar race crumbled. Only the light of the eyes remained bright for some time. Having delivered the single and decisive blow, Lack began to slowly raise his head, looking at the vampires who had turned towards him. Lack was very serious. In a small room, which could be called a small throne room, stood 4 lower vampires, and at the very end, a 6th one sat rather leisurely. The vampire did not say a word, but only silently watched what would happen next. The vampire lord did not yet know the young man who had come to him, so he was confident in his powers. Lack rushed forward, holding his sword tightly in his hands. The lower vampires, without waiting for any command from the lord, immediately rushed towards the boy. The first 2 needed only 1 blow, as did the servant who escorted Lack. The guy was quite agile and did not waste a second of time. The 2 remaining vampires, one of whom had already begun his transformation, looked at each other, shouting at the boy who he was. Points of light began to form around them. Only when the last line of his assistants had already been defeated did the sixth man deign to rise from his throne, his clean coat fluttering in the currents of air. The lower vampires were interested in the reason for their master's behavior. As it turned out, the magic arrows were not summoned by Lack, but by the sixth. The young man told the vampire that he expected nothing less from such an evil boss. All the sixth man responded to was laughter, and then the vampire began to draw his blade, calling Lack a damned monster. Lack immediately ran towards him, shouting for the vampire to speak for himself. As soon as the vampire lord managed to hold back the boy's first blow, he immediately realized who he was dealing with. The vampire's expression changed and he continued to defend himself. Locke attacked so quickly that he didn't even give his opponent a chance to counterattack. It felt like the great sage was just playing with the lord. After delivering a hail of blows to the body, where the lord was able to avoid hits, Lack decided to attack with a thrust and almost hit right in the head if the vampire had not dodged. The young man cut part of the vampire's face, extending his bloody smile to his cheek. Locke himself smiled and said that the lord had a pretty good sword and the guy would like to walk with it. The vampire wasn't going to give up so easily. He knocked Lack's sword aside and then decided to use a spell. A small magic ball began to grow rapidly in his hand. The guy immediately hit him in the face with his boot. The vampire lord only managed to wheeze, asking the boy why him. The next moment, the hand in which the lord had previously held the sword was already flying to the floor, separated from the body. Then Luck began to deal with the second hand, with which the lord wanted to cast the spell. The slashing blow hit the target, incidentally catching the vampire's belly. Left without an arm and mortally wounded, the vampire raised his head and stared at the boy through the thin lens of his glasses. The lord wanted to know who he was. Locke looked at the vampire who was already on his last legs. The youth firmly said that his name was Locke and he was an F-rank adventurer in the guild. The vampire muttered something thoughtfully, then said that since he had taken retribution from his quick counterattack, their attack should fail. Then the vampire added that everything was very bad. Locke lifted his sword from the ground and pointed it towards the sixth man's head. The boy asked how he had managed to get his minions into the royal palace. Before speaking, the vampire coughed again, spitting out blood. He looked at the young man with tired eyes and asked if he really thought the lord would answer him. Locke made a slightly indignant face, but he didn't expect anything else, to be honest. The guy told the vampire about it, after which he moved his blade forward with a sharp movement. Even with the vampire's head already pierced by his sword, he managed to address Luck, telling him to try to live in health and peace until that day came. His last words, wheezing, were a plea for Lack to enjoy his short and miserable life, until the day came when their lord would strike down the boy and all the other humans. Lack continued to hold his sword where it was, and the sixth lord's body slowly turned to ashes. After a few seconds, a small pile formed, where the cursed talisman lay. Lack, noticing it, moved his sword towards the mountain of ash and pierced the talisman, splitting it evenly into two halves, just as they had done with the last one of the ape. Lack continued to stand there, and in his head at this time, a bunch of voices of innocent people were screaming, asking to be saved. The voices were asking for help and begging for mercy. The voices continued and their echoes grew louder in the head of the great sage. He also heard children who called their mother and said how much they were in pain. The young man unclenched his hand, which was holding the handle, and the blade gradually began to absorb all the ominous aura that was in this small room. After that, Lack looked towards the wooden door, above which hung a couple of torches. It seemed as if the fading voices were still very dimly coming from there. Lack headed towards the door, wanting to know what was behind it. The guy opened the passage, saw several small skeletons, which probably belonged to children. The young man walked a little closer, then bent down on one knee. Slowly placing his hand on one of the skulls, Locke apologized for not being able to save them all. Luck went on to say that it must be scary, it must be difficult, and it must be pretty. Then the guy gritted his teeth and apologized again for everything the victims of this struggle had gone through. Lack promised that he would avenge all who suffered. The citadel began to hear the screams of the vampires. They realized that they had been invaded. The horde of vampires, who at that time were sleeping like bats, hanging upside down, began to wake up, opening their eyes. After that, they all rushed to attack. Lack walked calmly towards them. The vampires were getting closer and closer, and the young man began to swing his sword. defeating everyone who dared to attack him. In Lack's eyes, only rage was visible, and the guy seemed to be in a state of some kind of battle trance. He continued to chop the bodies of the vampires, who were crushed after the first hit. Blood settled on the walls, ceiling, and floor, but Luck confidently continued to move towards the exit, being completely untouched. The scream of vampires could awaken the blood in the veins of the most ordinary mortal and even hero. Soon the screams died down and the blood from the walls fell down, turning into that very vampire ash. Lack continued to move along the completely strewn ash, seeing the glitter of magic stones beneath him. Finally, after walking a few meters, Locke was able to step on the stone covering under his feet. The young man continued moving towards the exit, passing the last arch. Coming out onto the outer walls of the citadel, the boy looked into the distance, where the village with the 6 people subordinated to him had been before. Then Lack turned his gaze and saw clothes, near which there was also ashes. At that moment, the boy realized that there was no way to save a man who had been subjugated and had all his blood sucked out. If he lost his lord, he would simply turn to dust. Having reached the very village that the local vampires had subjugated, the young man walked along the streets, realizing that there were no more living people here at all. There was a full moon in the night, which illuminated most of the road along which Lack moved. Leaves were carried away by a light breeze, and soon the young man saw the lights of the walls of the royal capital. The city guards stood with torches along the wall, ready to fight. Golan, armed with a huge 2-handed sword, stood like a barbarian next to the gallant Eric. Suddenly, the huge guildmaster looked into the distance in surprise, seeing a dark silhouette of a man with the build of a teenager begin to appear in front of him. Eric immediately realized who was coming towards them. The king smiled and immediately greeted his friend, who was holding a small bag in his hand. Locke did not react and continued to walk towards them. The young man turned over the bag, which immediately rattled and began to pour out magic stones, indicating that he had dealt with all the sickening vampires in that place. Eric smiled, thanking Locke for his work. He also decided to lighten the mood a bit, saying that it was just a normal Tuesday for the guy, apparently. Locke said that the nearby villages were completely destroyed. The young man added that he blamed himself for not being able to reveal the vampire's plans earlier. Gul'dan said sternly, "I remind Lack that just 10 days ago the boy was far from this world." Afterwards, Golan added that the only one who should be held responsible for this is he, the guildmaster. The man also said that he sent people to those villages. They deserved a decent burial. When Lack went downstairs, he saw the tied-up girl and asked who it was. Celis replied that it was Rowan's maid, and yet it looked like she was charmed. Seeing the people under his command turn to dust in the citadel, Lack exhaled and said that he was glad, because it was just a charm. The guy also added that they could try to cure the girl. Celis, who heard this, also said that it was a great relief to her. Luck turned to her and smiled shyly, seeing that the girl was safe and unharmed. Suddenly, Eric joined the conversation, saying with a serious face that it was all thanks to Luck who was able to defeat that lord. He also said that 5 people in the castle turned to ashes, and another 30 lost consciousness. Afterwards, Eric concluded by saying that if these subordinates and enchanted people were even in the castle, then they could no longer call this place safe for the divine rooster. After hearing all this, Lack said that he had decided everything. The great sage said that he would go with Gerber to the High Lord and kill him. Of course, the boy was ready to lay down his life to protect him. Without further ado, Golan slowly turned his head to look at Eric, who was already looking at his comrade, smiling slightly. Eric blinked back at him, after which Golan called out to Lack. Golan, smiling broadly, said that it was the best choice for the situation. Then the man added that on top of everything else, it would be great if he and Eric followed Lauk. Locke turned and stared at his comrades in surprise. He hadn't expected them to want to go with him either. Golan had explained that they had no right to fail this mission. A group of them, yours, would be much more reliable. Lack opened his mouth wide and said that this was all great. But did his friends know that one of them was the king and the other was the guildmaster? Golan happily exclaimed that they were fully prepared for battle. Shia couldn't believe that the day had come when she would see the legendary group reborn with her own eyes. Golan adjusted his cape and shouted that they would wipe the High Lord from the face of the earth. Meanwhile, somewhere in a large palace, 3 figures dressed in white robes were moving along a corridor. On their heads were headdresses with religious symbols. The girl, accompanied by 2 assistants, approached the door, where 2 more people in similar clothes were waiting for her. One of the assistants stopped fixing the lady's hair. The people at the door offered their sincere apologies for the fact that the lady had to come here at their call. The girl turned to the archpriest with a request to clarify the situation. The girl, who was accompanied by 2 assistants, was the queen of the kingdom of Mindaliberdar. She was called Queen Levi Leonard Ardennis. The archpriest turned to the queen and asked Her Majesty to follow him. They approached a large model that reflected the Earth's surface of the state. The priest said that the barrier of the royal capital was completely functional, but vibrations were noticed. Then the priest said that there was a more pressing problem. The queen extended her hand to her assistant, who held a small bag at the ready. The girl, seeing this gesture, immediately placed it in her mistress's hand. The queen then poured the contents onto the map. The archpriest saw the mixture begin to float above the map, concentrating at a certain point in the mountainous area. The woman said that she expected nothing less from the queen. The queen told the priest that a steed sent by King Eric had recently arrived. The riders said that they wanted to gather forces and strike at the vampire High Lord. The priestess, who was slightly excited, began to say that this was the place. The queen ordered the people to contact the beastman, adding that the High Lord was hiding somewhere in the mountains. The priests asked the queen if she had sent a reply letter to King Eric. Queen Levi said that it was already on its way, but it would be better to send the message with the beastman. Team Lack was already on the road, heading to the neighboring kingdom. Levi approached the priest, telling her to provide her with as many A-class priests as she could. The queen, continuing to watch her magical sands spiral over the mountains, said that they would strengthen the barrier of this mountain range and restrict the movements of the High Lord. The archpriest turned to Queen Levi, saying that the girl herself was not going to go with the priests. The queen replied that King Eric himself would go there, and that it was her duty too. The archpriestess exclaimed that she would gather everyone and then rush down the corridor holding her long dress. One of the assistants rushed after her. The high priest ran a little ahead, saying that things were getting very serious. The assistant picked up her pace a little, saying that the woman looked a little agitated. It is said that the sacred magic of Her Majesty the Queen is the most powerful in the history of their order of sacred magic. What could be more glorious than to stand shoulder to shoulder with such an entity and unite with it in sacred prayers? It is said that she was not part of the group that enslaved the Mage ruler as she was pregnant. But it is also said that thanks to the participation of Her Majesty the Queen, the great sage Lack was able to return. Suddenly, Lack sneezed loudly, then began to wipe his nose. Goblin, who was riding behind, immediately asked if the boy had caught a cold, since he had probably slept on his stomach all night. Golan added that he would warm Lack's belly next time. Lack himself thought that Golan was still acting like a mommy to him. Lack replied that he was fine. It was just a little chilly outside. Golan added that if Queen Levi were here with them now, she would be able to cure the boy in the blink of an eye. Lack exclaimed in surprise, then added that he had never seen her. Eric turned to the great sage and said that they left Levi in charge of the Order of Sacred Magic. She was currently in the cathedral and she also wanted to see Locke in good health. Shia was slightly startled by their conversation, immediately joining in. The girl asked if they were really talking about Her Majesty Queen Levi now. Lux said that was true. The guy added that Levi was originally the healer in their group, when the guys were still simple adventurers. Shia said that now she understood why she was not in the castle. Lack turned to Eric and asked if Levi had been in the castle. Would she have been able to prevent the attack of the smaller ones? Eric said yes, because they had a great advantage. Eric added that he could only hope that they would not attack again. After all, they could trust this place to Celis and the others. Right now, they needed to focus on the High Lord. Lack turned forward and said that Eric was right. Celis stood in front of the royal castle, holding her sword in her hands. Next to her stood Lucilius, who crossed his arms and also held a cage covered with a kerchief. Celis now recalled how she had approached her father and asked him to take the girl with him so that she could join the battle. Golan had merely closed his eyes and curtly refused. Celis began to protest, still clinging to her father. The girl said that she had undergone sufficient combat training, after which she added that no lesser vampire could defeat her. Golan exhaled, then said sternly that he would be honest with his daughter. The man explained that Celis would be a liability on this trip, then asked her not to force him to say anything else. The girl just squeezed her hand and then lowered her head down. She was very upset, but nevertheless she understood, and was not going to argue with her father anymore. Lucilius stood nearby and watched their conversation. Lack suddenly turned to Golan and called out to him. The youth said that Golan could give one of his swords to his daughter. Golan looked at Lack questioningly, then asked why he would do that. Lack began to explain that he had seen Celis copying his father's fighting style, which was Golan's style. She also had the strength to match. Not as strong as her father, of course, but it still meant that she would be better suited to a long sword with a long reach in combat. Golan began scratching the back of his head, then turned to his daughter. He looked at Celis, who had her hands clasped together, and was supporting Lack with a cat-like gaze. Lack decided that a few more arguments were needed to finally sway Golan. Then the young man said that there was a possibility that other spawn of the Lord were hiding in the castle. Lack wanted Celis to protect the princesses and the others. Celis looked at Lack, who immediately winked at her, and added that he believed in his student. Celis immediately blossomed, casting aside her resentment at her father for refusing to take her along on the journey. She looked happily at Luck and said that this task could be safely left to her. Celis continued to stand in the courtyard, watching the leaves sway back and forth through the air. She wondered if it was actually Luck's sweet talk that had seduced her, or maybe she just thinks so. But now the situation is not what it seemed. Several vampires are approaching them, flying on their wings in the night. Lucilius began to hide behind Celis. The vampires began to show their horrible smiles when they saw the two children. Afterwards, they demanded that the bird be given to them, calling the little demon a stupid boy. Lucilius grabbed the covered cage tighter, hiding it under his clothes. Celis began to swing her sword, demonstrating her mastery of the weapon. The girl pointed her father's sword at the three monsters, who were already preparing to resolve the matter in a non-peaceful way. Celis said that she, Locke's greatest disciple, a warrior of the F rank with the surname Morton, was at their service. The vampire who was talking to the girl started laughing, saying that she was only an F rank. The lower one thought that she was joking, but at that moment, before he could finish speaking, his head split into two parts. The vampire's legs began to give way, throwing his body to the ground. You could see the edges of his fingers already starting to turn to dust. Celis remained in a fighting stance for some time. When the entire body finally began to evaporate, and the other two vampires realized that there was no room for jokes here, they prepared their magical marks, preparing to attack. The girl immediately remembered the words of Lack, who told her that a warrior has only one way to defeat a sorcerer: to use the tip of the sword to get to the enemy first. Looking back quickly, the girl took a quick and short step forward, after which she realized that the distance should be enough for her. Celis swung her sword, cutting through the vampires' bodies. One of the vampires, seeing how the warrior girl was able to put up a decent resistance, shouted to the others to forget about her and grab the divine rooster. Celis heard this and, defeating another vampire attacking her, turned her head and screamed the demon's name. Lucilius ran away, but one of the vampire's hands began to reach him. Just as the vampire was about to grab him, Lucilius threw off the rag and a very bright light appeared from there. The vampire, who was catching up with his target, was a little taken aback, not understanding what was happening. A huge bird suddenly began to appear in front of the vampires from a small cage, completely ablaze like a phoenix. They certainly did not expect this, covering themselves from the fire. The vampires began to panic and shout that Phoenix was fighting on their side. Lucilius stood and continued to control his illusion, without showing any visible gestures. Celis turned around and thought that, as always, the boy was performing wonderful illusions. Even if she knew the truth, her body still felt hot. The girl thought that she should give the fleeing enemies to Lucilius. Then she turned forward and saw several more aggressive vampires flying towards her. Celis tightened her grip on her sword, mentally addressing Luck. She mentally told him that they could trust her with the castle, and then she charged. Meanwhile, Lack and his team of Shia, King Eric and Guildmaster Golan, were already very close to the place where they were originally heading. They made a short stop, looking around the mountain slopes. The sacred rooster began to move under the cloak that Lack was covering himself with. The boy looked down with a smile, slightly pushing the cloth aside, after which the deity looked out. Gerber'd sacred rooster and told him that the boy knew how cramped he was now. But the rooster should remain under the cloak so that Lack would protect it. Eric's face became much darker, and then he said that if you think about it, the High Lord is hiding a day's journey away from the royal capital. By doing so, it was as if he was humiliating them. Golan added that, with all this, they were going to break every bone in their bodies to find the location of the High Lord on this mountain range, the terrain of which was simply terrible for a human. Lack heard some strange noise that was approaching him very quickly from the bushes. Suddenly, someone jumped out of the forest and landed right in front of them on the road. The creature bowed its head, closing its eyes, and then announced that, in accordance with the decree of Her Highness the Queen, the beastman had exposed the High Lord's hiding place. The beastman said that they could trust them, even if they had to sacrifice their tribe's pride. Then he glanced sideways at Shia, who was in the saddle. Shia said that this was an opportunity for His Majesty to witness the valor of the Lycan tribe. They must bravely enter the battle in the name of their tribe and father. After that, the girl confidently told them not to disgrace the beastman people. Shia added that she relied on them, after which the whole group moved on. Lack called the girl, then took out a blade and threw it towards Shia. The girl looked in surprise at the sword that the great sage handed her. Shia couldn't believe it. She started to say something, but Luck beat her to it and told her that he had taken the sword from the Sixth Lord. The girl said that it was an incredible sword of light. Lack added that this open blade remained intact, despite meeting his sword, which Lack received from the ruler of Mage. This emphasized its excellent quality, and now it belongs to Shia. Looking around at his friends, Lack said that Eric had a sacred sword, and Golan had a magical sword of fire. The great sage himself had the sword of the ruler of Majin, and the girl must match it. Luck said that if they were going to go against the High Lord, her current sword might not be reliable. It wouldn't be a good thing if the girl was let down by her weapon in battle. Shia said that she had a hard time fighting the Goblin Lord and her sword was broken. Lack added that the girl's sword wouldn't break so quickly now. Shia looked down, thinking that Lack saw her enthusiasm. Golan excitedly said that the Lord's sword might be cursed. Lack glared at him, saying that he had already checked everything. Shia smiled widely, saying that she would accept it with gratitude either way. The girl clenched her hand into a fist and said that she would cover her group's back and they could rely on her. A couple of hours later, Eric turned his gaze to the sky, urging everyone to look as well. There were many vampires flying across the sky on their large wings. Eric said that everything seemed to be going according to plan. The only problem was that the beastman showed them the entrance to the shelter. But there was nothing there. Shia pointed firmly ahead of her where the entry point should be, then said that the cloak magic should be cast there. Lack looked in the same direction and agreed. Lack extended his hand, commanding the veil to open. A magical seal flashed before his hand, and it shot towards the stone mountain wall. The seal began to slowly approach, and before the group's eyes, flashes of illusion appeared, as if someone had thrown a stone into water. After a few moments, the magic dissipated, and they saw a passage. Locke got off his horse, then stood up, straightening his back. He kept one hand in front of him, smoothly joining the other one. The guy called the spell Sleepy Cloud. A large cloud, more like a white transparent spirit, rushed forward, penetrating the dark passage. Lack told the group that they could follow. The colors of the night only continued to thicken. Golan quickly moved forward, thinking that the vampire family might have high mental resistance. As he continued to run, he realized that, against the magic of the sleepy cloud, all the lesser vampires and subordinate humans were powerless. Only the superiors and lords should remain, so Golan had no intention of holding back. Quickly closing the distance to the two vampires who were standing and thinking about what had happened to one of their servants, Golan immediately cut them down, thereby attracting the attention of the others. Some of those who remained on their feet rushed towards the hero, but Golan struck the floor with his magical sword of fire, causing a large and long wave of fire. Everyone in the way began to burn, turning into ash and sand even faster. Golan threw his sword over his shoulder and continued to walk forward, past the scorching tongues of flame. A little wary, he suspected something ahead. Several vampires were sitting in a dark room, preparing their spell. They were all watching the warrior's shadow with anticipation. Golan paused for a moment, taking his next step. The vampires were waiting for him, ready to rain down hundreds of magical arrows on the hero as soon as he approached. Afterwards, the vampires thought that for some reason the warrior was delayed. Meanwhile, Golgan began to swing, wanting to outplay his opponent by a few steps. Golgan smashed his blade through the wall with a powerful blow. continuing to cut through the stone blocks of the citadel. Everyone who was behind the wall immediately burst into flames from the magical fire. Goblin looked with disdain at the burning vampires, who, like cockroaches or rats, began to run out of their hiding place. Snorting, the guildmaster said that this was all complete boredom. Shia was simply amazed by what was happening before her eyes. The girl was speechless from the power that the heroes demonstrated. Lack shouted to Goblin that he, as always, was using the strongest attacks. Goblin laughed, saying that he hadn't even warmed up yet, and then added that he would never lose to the youth. Shia thought that the cutting blade captain of the legendary hero group was simply overwhelming. Eric cut off the jokes and laughter, telling the group that their goals seemed to be very close. He called for everyone to gather, and they entered one of the root-covered tunnels. The citadel, which was made of stone, suddenly ended abruptly. The walls began to expand in length and width, and its foundation was woven from something that resembled tree roots. A girl in a black, elegant lace dress came out to meet the legendary group and announced in a solemn voice that she had finally found His Royal Majesty. She had pointed ears like all vampires and long claws on her hands. The girl bowed her head slightly, then announced that she was sorry, but her master was not here. Afterwards, she asked the people to kindly leave these chambers. Raising her head and smiling, it became clear that she also had fangs. She added that the group could leave their lives here, if that was what they came here for. Golan looked at her menacingly and said that if she thought that some ordinary lord would leave them, she was mistaken. The strong point is expressed only in pretentiousness. The girl chuckled at the big guy's comment. She began to pull the broken cursed medallion out of her secret feminine place with her thin fingers. After slightly straightening the two halves so that they could be seen, the girl said that most likely the group was familiar with this object. Golan replied that it was a cursed medallion. Lack stared at him, immediately noticing that the locket was broken. The girl continued, saying that she had received special permission to use this cursed thing. The ground beneath the hero's feet began to tremble, and soon a huge black silhouette of a dragon appeared. The girl spread her arms and her wings appeared from behind her back. She solemnly declared that this place was the nest of this creature. Golan raised his head slightly, looking at the dragon. A drop of sweat was running down his temple, after which the guildmaster said that he had a bad feeling about all of this. As the dragon approached, each step it took continued to shake the ground. As it got closer, it opened its mouth and began to scream at the group of several people standing there. When the creature got closer to the light and it became clear what it was, Golan shouted that it was a zombie dragon. The girl immediately corrected him, saying that it was an ancient zombie dragon. Afterwards, this girl, being one of the vampire lords, brazenly called the group of adventurers a bunch of country bumpkins. She also asked if they really thought they could defeat the dragon. After her words, the dragon immediately began to spew out its deadly breath from its mouth. Eric, who stood in front, created a magical holy shield that protected them. Shia, close, shouted that this was an extremely caustic and poisonous breath. The guy also warned that if it completely covered someone, only bones would remain. Golan glanced at Eric, who immediately nodded his head. The king raised his shield again, telling Lack that the dragon had gone a bit wild, and Golan added that the boy should go and find the High Lord while they held the dragon there. Eric smiled and quietly said that they owed Lack an unpayable debt. After all, back then, 10 years ago, the guy had simply walked into a one-way interdimensional rift that had closed without the possibility of opening it from this side. They both smiled and turned to the great sage of their group, asking the boy to leave this part of the adventure on their shoulders and move on calmly. Lack looked at them in surprise, completely forgetting himself for a second. He was in complete amazement. The young man smiled and said that he agreed to such conditions. The boy grabbed Shia and then ran in the other direction. Lack shouted that he was leaving the dragon and the lord at their own risk. A bright portal began to appear from above. The vampire lord looked up as Luck walked away from her. She screamed that the boy really thought he could get away from here that easily. Golan was already standing behind her, smiling widely, showing almost all of his teeth. The man asked the vampire if she really had time to look around. Golan's question was immediately followed by a blow from his magical sword of fire. He split the girl in half, but she was intangible. It was an illusion of the Lord. Her real body suddenly appeared behind Golan, causing a small scratch on his cheek, from which blood began to flow. The girl said that she did not use the medallion's full power on the zombie dragon. This only meant that the girl herself had used a significant part of the cursed artifact, and now she had become several times stronger than the other lords. Meanwhile, Queen Levi had already gathered the priests in a large and spacious lodge. Now the girl was going to implement her plan, which could help in the battle with the vampires. Levi looked at everyone in the room and said that their task now was to strengthen the entire barrier around the location where the High Lord was located, and they had to prevent his movement. Queen Levi walked forward and called for everyone to begin praying for divine protection. The queen herself walked forward and crossed her arms over her chest, holding a large staff. Also, at the same time, at the location where the High Lord was, another battle was also being fought between vampires and beastmen, which was supposed to lure the main forces out of their hiding place. The beastmen fought bravely, but at the same time, just like the vampires, they gradually suffered losses. They were significantly fewer than the vampires in the Lord's army, but none of them retreated. The same guy who brought his report to the legendary group suddenly saw one of his comrades die. After that, laughter rang out, to which the beastman involuntarily raised his eyes. On a low rock stood a vampire who was dressed in an exquisite noble suit. He straightened his shoulders widely, then shouted for the beastmen to take their time and he would destroy them all. The other lower vampires also advanced behind this person. One of the beastmen shouted that this was a lord. At least 3 of them had to attack him at the same time. The 3 beastmen immediately rushed to attack the vampire lord standing in the vanguard. He successfully dodged 2 or 3 attacks, then used magic to create an explosion that was directed at his pursuers. The young beastman turned to one of his commanders and said that there seemed to be several lords on the field. He suggested a gradual retreat, engaging them in a war of attrition. As soon as the beastmen heard the gong being struck, they immediately began to run, actually retreating into the thicket. One of the lords looked after them and laughed. He noticed that they wanted to run away, but thought that they would not be able to do so easily. The second lord who came up noticed that they wanted the vampires to follow them. The lords agreed on one point and began to discuss. One of them also said that the beastmen wanted to send a separate assault force to the location of their High Lord, and rather, he was already there. One of them clenched his teeth and began to laugh. This quickly set off a chain reaction, and the laughter began to spread further. The lords knew that the group inside was in for a surprise. One of the lords spoke poorly of the beastmen's tactics, saying that they would not be able to defeat a High Lord with their stupid and obvious plans anyway. The other lord laughed even louder, saying that their lord, after all, had immeasurable power running through his veins. The lord himself, to whom the dark gods were drawn, sat on his throne. Lack, who had been making his way through the tunnels all this time, tracking the Dark Lord's energy, soon approached his room and knocked it out with a kick. The door was blown into several pieces, varying in size. The Lord covered himself a little, seeing a flash of bright light in the threshold. After that, Luck himself entered inside. The Lord smirked, saying the people by nature are very rude. He was convinced of this again and again. Even now, when he was in his chambers, people burst in on him without an invitation or knock. The Lord himself began to smile broadly, saying that he, as it seemed to him, should teach a lesson in good manners to his uninvited guests. Seeing the Lord's face covered in some bandages, Shia immediately realized that this was their highest. The girl, as a beastman by race, felt a thirst for blood that was on a completely different level. Lack turned his head to Shay and said that this guy put a protective barrier on himself, so the girls should be more careful. Shay replied that she understood, after which she saw a slight smile towards Lack. Before he could finish his reasoning, Locke suddenly thrust his blade in front of him with a very quick movement of his hand, thereby parrying the attack of the High Vampire Lord. Locke himself had put up a magical barrier to protect himself, but despite all this, the High Lord was making very fast attacks, so it was impossible to relax at all. The High Lord exclaimed in amazement, smiled broadly and said that the boy had good reflexes for a human. His teeth were incredibly sharp and seemed to smell of blood that had recently been drunk. She stared as the High Lord quickly moved back and then thought that her eyes were unable to follow him. She realized that this was the High Lord's power. The Vampire Lord's pupils began to change shape slightly, emitting glimmers of subtle magic. Lack rolled his eyes, saying that the Lord could keep trying, but the charm wouldn't work on him. The High Lord was surprised by this and dropped his guard for a second. Lack took advantage of this and knocked him back with a blow from the flat side of his sword. which created a small metallic pop. The vampire looked at Locke again and began to take an increasing interest in him. The High Lord also said this directly to the young man, asking his name along the way. Locke replied that he had no name for a vampire. The Lord chuckled, saying that the young man was going to be rude to him until the very end. At that moment, Shia hid to the side. She looked at the High Lord's back, noting that the High Lord could have forgotten about the girl. In any case, there was a possibility of this, and a high one, as it seemed to Shia. Shia thought she would only have one chance to test her guess. At that time, the High Lord once again went to attack Locke, who, so far, easily repelled everything. The High Lord tried to attack in a variety of ways, combining physical and magical attacks. But Locke did not allow himself to be attacked in both ways, destroying the vampire's magical seals. The Lord was amazed that the boy managed to break through his protective barrier so quickly. At this time, Shia thought that if the barrier was broken, then this was the perfect opportunity to attack from behind. But the High Lord was indeed not that simple. He dodged the attack, twisting his body away from the sword. Shia couldn't believe it, and then saw the vampire's gaze on her. The High Lord said that this would be the end for the beastman girl. He raised his hand to strike, but Locke managed to stop him in time, hitting his hand with his blade. Locke firmly said that he would take his left hand first. Meanwhile, the severed limb fell to the floor, still searching for blood. The vampire stared at the cocky and rude boy. Shia smiled and, holding the blade close to her, loudly agreed with Locke. The girl understood that although the Lord could dodge her blows, but as long as she and Locke were together, they could win by acting together. The high vampire merely snorted, smirking at his opponent's mood. He picked up what was left of his arm and asked Locke if he was sure of his words. A black aura began to surround the arm, and where there had been nothing but a stump before, a fully functioning arm appeared again. Shia was very surprised by this. Locke, apparently, did too, but he hadn't expected such an easy victory. The High Lord smiled and said that the boy had a giant blade, but it was completely useless against him. Shia became even more nervous after hearing these words. She turned to Locke and asked him anxiously if the blades really wouldn't work against a vampire. Locke explained to the girl that this was all because of the enormous amount of magic that the High Lord possessed. He had much more of it than other lords, so it was impossible to absorb it all in one blow. Shia said that she understood everything. Then the girl added that from these words, it follows that the blades, to some extent, still work. Locke interrupted her, saying that he was advancing. However, Locke could tell that the High Lord was starting to get a little out of balance, a little out of his mind. The vampire was starting to realize that this wasn't going to be an easy fight for him. At the moment, Locke knew that he was most worried about Eric and Goblin, who were left to fight the vampire lord and the huge ancient dragon, the zombie. Goblin tried to keep up with the lord, who calmly floated in the air, attacking the warrior. The guildmaster skillfully parried the blows, but could not keep up with his agile opponent. As soon as a blow with a blade or claws followed, a subsequent magical attack always followed. Goblin again saw the flashes that signaled the appearance of magical arrows. Goblin exhaled heavily and said that this could go on forever. Eric heard this and immediately overtook his friend, rushing past. Goblin stared at his friend in surprise, calling out his name. Eric pointed behind him, saying that he was passing the baton to Golan, who was now to take care of the dragon. Golan turned around and immediately saw a shadow looming over him, completely blocking out the light. It was the dragon's tail, which was already heading towards the guildmaster. Golan only had time to let out a surprised cry before the ground was immediately covered by the dragon's huge tail. The beast began to turn its head, backing away. The vampire lord, who had already entered into battle with Eric, began to laugh loudly, saying that the king's fine manners had driven his comrade into the coffin. Eric, in fact, saw Golan covered by the large tail of the reptile. The king kept his cool, believing that his friend was completely safe, which he told the lord. Meanwhile, the tail that was covering Golan suddenly split into two parts. The guildmaster immediately cut off the part of the zombie dragon that was trying to kill him with a swing of his sword. The dragon noticed how he had lost his tail, and even though he was undead, he still screamed, either in pain or anger. Golan looked at him and said that it was a surprise for him. Golan said firmly that if the dragon could sense this despite its appearance, then it would be able to sense the fear of death. This was exactly the kind of opponent that suited the big guy. Eric turned around and watched his comrade, saying that he had simply put the right man in the right place. The smile on Eric's face began to anger the vampire lord. The girl soared upward, trying to fly away on her wings. Fear and despair were visible on her face. Eric set off after her, catching up with the vampire. The king shouted that she would not leave him. Unexpectedly for Eric himself, the girl appeared behind him, tightly hugging the king's shoulders. She smiled and whispered in his ear, asking what made him think she was going to leave. The next second, something happened that could have greatly affected the outcome of the battle. The vampire sank her fangs into King Eric's neck and began to drink his blood. A second figure of the Lord appeared in front of Eric himself, and he realized that it was cloning that the girl was able to do to him. The Lord only continued to smile widely. The girl drank some more blood, then began to lick the king's neck. She said that she would make an exception for Eric and invite him into her family. The clone she still controlled approached Eric and grabbed his chin, lifting his head towards her. Eye to eye, the Lord whispered that Eric would become her servant. She tried to do the same as the High Lord did at the beginning of the battle with luck. But the vampire's charms did not work on the heroes, and Eric grabbed the girl's horn and broke it with a sharp movement. It was a very serious injury for the girl, and her face quickly began to bleed. After that, Eric took out his blade and cut her body. The girl immediately turned into dust. Somehow, the girl survived. Maybe she used multiple clones. Eric landed and started shaking himself off while the Lord screamed why her spells weren't working on him. Eric smiled and decided to joke about the fact that his blood was already being sucked. The guy raised his left hand and showed a ring on his ring finger, saying that he was already married. Eric continued to smile, saying that the girl was not yet exhausted enough. He explained to her that the blood of heroes gives high resistance to mental attacks and poison. He then raised his hand to his head, continuing to sneer at the vampire. Eric added that his blood was apparently perfect for killing witches, but the Lord was not going to tolerate the man's ridicule, after which she created several magical marks with which she was going to attack. She shouted that Eric was a scoundrel, after which magical arrows came out of the marks. But something instantly went wrong. The vampire's magic signs began to crack, shaking her in place. Her attack failed, which left a strong impression on the girl. The Lord began to get nervous, saying that her powers were starting to fade. She looked up, clenching her sharp teeth. The Lord couldn't believe it. It was a sacred barrier. Queen Levi led the common prayer in the cathedral. All those present recited the same prayer, merging into one strong voice. The beastmen began to look up and also saw the sacred barrier that hung over the vampire's hideout. They realized that the Lord's movements had slowed down now, so they had to attack. Eric, meanwhile, while the vampire continued to weaken and rebel, did not continue her torment, delivering one strong and precise blow, which interrupted the Lord's life for good. The blow proved fatal. Before turning to ashes, she said that the people should not rejoice. Cursing everyone, she added that they did not stand a single chance against the High Lord. Goblin heard these words, which meant Eric's victory to him. The guildmaster gripped his sword tighter and confidently looked towards the ancient zombie dragon. Goblin rolled his shoulders a few times as if to loosen them up, and then said that it was time for him to finish his opponent. He then quickly rushed towards the dragon. Having already dealt with several parts of the dragon, Goblin suddenly froze when he was about to launch another attack. His body was frozen, but it was not at all because the monster was afraid. The old hero rolled his eyes, clutching his back with his hand. He drawled pitifully, complaining of his lower back. The dragon realized that this was a moment he could take advantage of. The dragon directed its poisonous breath at Goblin, but the hero was not melted, and no bones remained of him. The adventurer's immunity withstood the blow, and he was thrown aside. Goblin was thrown to the side of one of the walls, which was covered in roots. The hero began to stand up, slightly securing his lower back. He thanked the dragon for the attack, as it helped him recover. Goblin swung his fire magic sword with the right amount of force. The dragon was hit, and Goblin then set it on fire with the magic of his weapon. The dragon wheezed as its body began to slowly fall apart into many pieces. Flames spread throughout its body, burning away the remains of its flesh. As soon as Golan finished, he slowly began to approach Eric. Eric said that Golan was getting old, to which the guildmaster responded immediately by saying that he hadn't warmed up properly. The battle against the High Lord continued as well. Shia and Lack tried to attack simultaneously, but the vampire was doing a pretty good job so far. The Great Sage and the Beast Girl also put in a lot of effort. Lack had previously dealt with his opponents much faster and easier. This encounter reminded him of the ruler of Mage. They also noticed that the High Lord's movements were beginning to slow down due to the power of the sacred barrier created by Queen Levi. It was time to attack with renewed vigor. With a quick glance at each other, Shia and Lack understood each other. Shia decided to start by trying to pierce the High Lord, while Lack prepared to deliver a more serious and powerful blow. To slightly lower the vigilance of the High Lord himself and distract him with an unpleasant trick, Lack pointed his hand at the vampire, then used life transfer and drain touch. It worked just as Luck had hoped. The magic instantly burned the vampire's face, who screamed in pain. Seeing the vampire stagger to the side, Luck prepared to swing. The sword strike hit where it was supposed to. The high vampire's body was split in two, causing him to cry out. But that was far from the end of the fight. The High Lord managed to use his vampire abilities, which allowed him to avoid this blow. The monster's body seemed to become a black mist surrounded by bats. Suddenly, completely unexpectedly for Lack and the vampire, from under the clothes of the great sage, a rooster's cry was heard, which began to crow. The Lord noticed, then saw the bird's head. The Lord began to smile strangely. The Lord immediately exclaimed that the divine rooster was here. His voice was very joyful, to which Lack immediately responded. The magician said that nothing would change, because his defeat was carved in stone. The Lord stuck out his tongue, and the cursed medallion that was connected to his body began to be seen. The vampire said that they were complete fools if they brought him a sacrifice here. Lack's eyes widened when he saw the cursed medallion. He knew they could use it to empower themselves. The High Lord immediately bit off part of his tongue, breaking the medallion. His oppressive aura began to spread around and go further. The Lord's body also began to change, acquiring a different incarnation of clothing and body. Locke continued to hold back, realizing that the Lord was a destructive force. The staff that Queen Levi was holding suddenly cracked, starting to scatter throughout the cathedral. Some of the priests who were taking part in maintaining the barrier suddenly started coughing, spitting blood down. More than half of them were like that. A drop of blood was also running down Queen Levi's face. She understood that their power was being resisted. One of the high priests immediately ran up to her. The man addressed the queen as His Majesty. The priest said that Levi already understood. A powerful anti-barrier was installed over the mountain surface. Lack, looking at the High Lord, thought that this simply could not be. The vampire laughed loudly and proudly, saying that they had now experienced the divine protection of the dark gods. The Lord's voice also changed. He extended his hand to Lack, who continued to bend on one knee, and then told the youth to let him taste the blood of the divine rooster. Eric and Golan, having finished their business, ran away from the cave where the dragon was. Golan said that he noticed some strange power. Eric replied that it seemed that their support barrier had been destroyed. Eric sped up as fast as he could, telling Golan that he was worried about Lack. It was for this reason that the king had asked his comrade in arms Golan to hurry. The High Lord's aura continued to reverberate on Lake and Shia, who took the blow from the closest position. The sage began to rise to his feet, holding his sword in his hands. Locke and Shia noticed a dark element hovering behind the vampire lord. Apparently, it was the very same divine protection of the dark gods. The vampire grinned as he looked towards Lack, who couldn't move. The Lord told him that the titanic power that had struck them was the blow of the gods they worshipped. The High Lord continued to smile, saying that because of this divine power, they, the High Lords, and even from the Master, cannot act in the royal capital. But the opposite is also true. Because of the dark god's divine protection, they become held as much as the god loves them. Looking at Locke, the Lord said that it seemed that Locke's god loved him very much. Lack really didn't have the strength to even just get off the ground. He looked at the vampire with his last strength, realizing that his head hurt so much, as if it would split right now. In the cathedral, the priests were still trying to recover from the blow. One of the priests approached Levi and said that it was very dangerous to continue. The royal capital's barrier will also be subject to evil influence if further attempts are made. Levi wiped the blood from her head and asked to give her a second staff. The queen turned and said that even if she were alone, she would never give up. She shouted that King Eric and his comrades were now fighting for their country. Afterwards, she shouted that they could not be called a holy church if they could not provide divine protection. These words inspired the priests, and they began to shout that they could restore the magical barrier. Levi smiled and said that she would take care of their lives. The archpriest stood aside while the other priests rushed to the queen, began to support Levi. The man watched all this, after which he said that they would never change. The archpriest continued to smile, and then said that Levi was quite obedient like a queen. But her true form was Levi Ardennis, who was nicknamed the True Saint. The Dragon Fist Maiden. Lack continued to look ahead, and then an idea came to him. The hero began to move, something the High Vampire Lord could not have expected at all. He immediately shouted that Lack could move. Then he praised the great sage, saying that he was not bad at all. The High Lord began to call upon one of the attack spells. Lack used the double barrier on himself, preventing the vampire's attack that was flying towards him from behind. The boy began to climb the massive roots that had grown after the medallion was broken. Lack used the magic ability Puppet on himself. All his muscles screamed that they were being torn to pieces, but the magician was forced to use it on himself again, since this was the only way to make himself move. Overcoming unreal pain, Lack's entire face was covered in cold sweat. The young man looked up, where the very element of the dark gods was levitating, and realized that this was his main goal now.